Ah, good day, ladies and gents, wherever you may be around the world, and welcome to this special Australia Day stream. I've got a couple more guests joining me after the Lady of Shalott, who's just here. And while we're waiting for those, I'm going to start us off with a tune. If it plays, you never know, it might.
They came of bold and roving stock that would not fix the bite. They were the sons of field and flock. Since he may not hope to men in these degenerate years of the brave old pioneer. 'Twas they who rode the trackless bush, storm and drought. 'Twas they who heard the mother out. 'Twas they who followed up the trail, the mountain, and pressed the clock when now their bones are laid. Unknown where and spy promised land from off the ranges.
Okay, that was Pioneers, which was originally a Banjo Patterson poem set to music. Welcome to my guest, Lady of Shalott and Tim Wilms, and shortly I think we're going to be joined by Marcus Furious, who we've all had a little bit of technical issues, shall we say. Lady of Shalott had some problems with her sound. As usual, I had problems playing my music. Tim was sorting his avatar out, and Marcus apparently got an untimely Windows update. So hopefully he'll join us soon. So anyway, happy Australia Day, everybody. How are we today?
Happy Australia Day.
Yeah, happy Australia Day. Lovely, thank you. Really good. Fantastic day, and very, very proud to be on this lovely, enormous island today.
What have you been doing today, Lady of Shalott? I know that you're out in the sticks, aren't you? Somewhere in the,
very much so.
the nice
very
rural
much so.
parts of Australia.
Yeah. I'm in Gippsland, and down here, they just love it. There's Australia flags everywhere. Everyone having a great time. Not one mention of Invasion Day. And other than government buildings, you don't see the Aboriginal flag. It's only flown on government buildings, but it's quite remarkable to see the Australian flag on its own, whereas generally in Victoria you see it with the Aboriginal flag and the Victorian flag. So it's quite something to see just Australia on its own. It's fantastic.
I'm always surprised they fly the Torres Strait Islander flag down here. There's not many Torres Strait Islanders in Melbourne.
I know, that's it. Yeah, sorry, that's the other flag I was thinking of. I misthought there. It's the Torres Strait Islander flag, of course. Yeah, I know. What on earth has that got to do with Victoria?
I must say, I've got to say that I went out today and I was quite happy that in my suburb of Melbourne, I live about 50 kilometres outside of the CBD. And I have to say that I was quite happy today to see a number of houses decorated with Australian flags and what have you. So, so it's not completely dead yet by any means.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. You have to just get out of the city, and that's where you'll find the real Australia.
Tim, I know that you went to a special event today, and judging by the photograph that you put up on Twitter, or X as we should now call it, there were Australian flags all over that thing. So did you have a good day, mate?
I did very much at the Doncaster Bowling Club. So it was hosted by a Dissident actor, Damien Richardson. So he's been in Neighbours and City Homicide, but because he spoke out against the lockdowns and the vax, he's pretty much been cancelled. He stood both in the Senate and the state election, and so I thought it would make an excellent Australia Day to spend it with like-minded people. Doncaster is in Melbourne's east, and I think that Lady of Shalott and Iron Duke, you're both right. Everyone focuses on the city centre on Australia Day, but it shouldn't be a no-go zone for Australian flags. But outside that CBD zone, everyone else in suburbia and in regional and rural Australia is celebrating Australia Day. The media, they led with the Invasion Day tonight, and it's basically amplified that there is this debate around Australia Day, which there's not. I mean, the only people who created the so-called debate is the people who want to abolish it. And we should get out of this mindset of saying the debate's equal when it's not.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yep. No,
I tried to get a sort of a flavour of the water down here by asking people what did they think about changing the date, and they said, well, what for? I mean, they just don't. There's no understanding of why you would do that outside of the CBD and the activists and the people who have a vested interest in changing it. The rest of Australia just don't get it at all.
Look, I want to talk to Furious first about this, but I did have a point I wanted to make about this afterwards. But Furious, you're a rural Australian. You know, you come from a family of farmers and what have you. What have you been up to for Australia Day?
Firstly, thank you, Iron Duke. Lovely to be on. And obviously, I'm familiar with yourself and Lady Shalott, but I haven't been on a stream with Tim before, so I'll pass on my regards to Tim. Love your work, sir. So it's a pleasure to be able to
thank you very much. Good to
share a stream
with you as well.
Indeed, thank you, sir. Yes, Iron Duke, I appreciate your comment there insofar that it is actually kind of nice, and Lady Shalott touched on this, that once you sort of drive out, Tim even said it as well, you sort of drive out to even suburbia, you sort of start to see more of that, veneer is not really the right way to put it, but sort of, you do see that aspect of patriotism, you know, one might even dare say nationalism.
Yeah, you see cars driving around with Australian flags in their rear window, and houses that have got strings of Australian flags put around the front of their front.
Or if it's an old enough, if it's an old enough car with a metal aerial, they have like a flag tied to it or something like that, which is kind of it's quaint, but it's nice. And of course, the chattering classes and the academic and journalistic types will deride those people as being bogans and the like. There's always some kind of pejorative sneering at people who demonstrate patriotism in the Australian context. Certainly, I mean, I think we see it true in the English context as well. But it's more like the shabs and the working class types in England, you might say, that embody that. But obviously, that very similar class agitation exists here. Obviously being an Australia being a British colony, right? And you do have this kind of almost shameful inversion whereby you have people who are of a sort of more elite class, and rather having this spirit of noblesse oblige, right? They will thumb their nose and sneer at lesser people they perceive to be lesser, who demonstrate their pride in their country and their heritage and their identity. If you want to get into the nuts and bolts of it, you could even call it a pride in their ethnos, their collective identity. And just to touch on what Tim was saying, just as I jumped in, this is in the same way that people like Academic Age and talk about manufactured consent. What we actually have here are manufactured arguments, manufactured talking points. It is always, when you turn on, Channel 9 or Channel 10 or the ABC or SBS or whatever, it is always, and it's always from their point of view and their perspective, they will frame it as Invasion Day or the debate about the Australia Day or changing the date. It's because it's what they want. It's essentially their intention and their goal and their aim. The Australian people, by and large, don't want this, and they never have wanted this. But it's just rammed down their throat incessantly. And it's interesting that you take so much as a 10-minute drive out of any CBD, be it Melbourne or Sydney or Perth, Adelaide, Brisbane, wherever, and you start to see those flags, and you start to see those barbecues in backyards, or people in parks, and they got the Australian little bucket hat, and they got the Australian flag cups, and whatever. They're actually very happy to be part of this and take pride in demonstrating their loyalty and their appreciation for their nation and for what they have. So this dimorphism between the academic, journalistic, political types and the normal people is actually it's always evident, but on Australia Day especially, it is very, very pronounced.
Yeah, totally agree, mate. Totally agree. As I say, look, I'm only 50 kilometres outside of Melbourne CBD, and there are plenty of people with Australia Day decorations in their front gardens and Australian flags on their cars and stuff like that. It is nowhere near as unpopular as the lefty media would have you believe.
God no. And sorry, just to answer your question, if I may, Andrew, had a fabulous day actually. Funnily enough, like a typical European Australian, that we had a quorum installed in our shed today. So our family's been a bit preoccupied with work, but now they've had the afternoon free, I've been very happy to jump on and join you guys.
Cool, man. Cool. Always very welcome. The point I was going to make is that I was watching some people talking, which is something we have to talk about. Like, Captain Cook's statue in Melbourne was vandalized and torn down yesterday. And we'll talk about that in a bit more detail in a minute. And at the same time, they also vandalized a big statue and monument to Queen Victoria near the Botanic Gardens in Melbourne. The thing is that when they were talking about this on some of the news shows afterwards, you had these, mostly it has to be said, lefty Karen women, white women, turning around and saying, oh no, well, we should change it to the Day of Federation or something like that. But, Australia had been going for way over 100 years by the time of Federation,
Yeah, there's a culture which exists beforehand, and to some degree, it's even true of, say, when people talk about the United States of America, is that there actually was an American identity, certainly a community which you could call American, obviously is an extension of Britain in the same way that we're an extension of Britain, right? That predates 1776, in the same way that there's an Australia that predates 1901. You got to think, the Australians themselves actually had fought a war at the behest of the empire prior to Federation, which was the Boer War. They were sent, they joined and
more than that,
Southern Africa,
listen, I'm not going to tell you about military history theorists, but you know very well that the New South Wales contingent went to the Sudan in 1884 to go and try and save General Gordon.
Yeah, that's right.
And they were actually the first Australian diggers in many respects who went overseas. And Victoria offered a contingent, but they offered it too late, so the British didn't accept it. Or otherwise, the Victorians would have gone there too.
Indeed.
Which is partly why in Melbourne we have a huge statue of General Gordon. So.
Yeah, precisely. And the other thing is too, is that, sorry, I'll be quiet because I know I've been talking since I jumped on, but this idea too that, how modernists and, moderate types will sort of say that, you can just, arrive here and then, bang, you're an American, bang, you're Australian, or, I feel British, ergo I am British. And, someone who is literally descended from, the first, Jutes and Saxons who landed in southern Anglia or Dover are somehow the same as someone who attended university 5 years ago. Is just as English. In the same kind of fallacious thinking that from where that comes from. It's the same sort of thing with the idea of, we have this piece of paper which, this is our Declaration of Independence, or this is our Constitution, or this is our Federation, document. Thus, our nation starts here. And it's a case of, well, no, not really. In fact, there's this whole, body of history and events and folklore and narrative that forms our identity and forms our collective consciousness before these documents are sort of made. You got to think if anyone who sort of even went to school, let's say more than 15, 20 years ago, who actually had something resembling an education, you became familiar with Burke and Wills and Banjo Patterson, Ned Kelly. All these things happened before Federation.
Yep.
We had a cricket team that played in England before Federation, for goodness sake.
Long before, long before. I mean, the Ashes started really in the 1880s. The Ashes cricket test series started in the 1880s, really.
You've only got to read the Robert Hughes book to understand this goes way back. It's nothing to do with the start of the Federation. It goes right back. And it's disgusting that it begins here because we say so. Well, no.
I would say that if people are interested in early Australian history, I've got an hopefully ongoing series with Chris Gard on this channel, which looks at exactly that, early Australian history from the arrival of the First Fleet in 1788 onwards. We're up to episode 2, and I'm hoping that eventually, once Chris is a little less busy because he's a new dad,
also he's rebuilding half of Queensland at the moment.
we'll be able to do episode 3, so that'll be good. But Chris, by the way, didn't join us this evening because he's on holiday with his family, and therefore I do not blame him at all. I just think there was an awful lot of Australian history that went on well before Federation. A lot of it. Federation made Australia an independent nation and a dominion, but that wasn't by any means the start of Australia's story. You can argue that the Aboriginal guys who lived in Australia for a long time and never built anything more permanent than a bark hut are part of that Australian story, but I don't think they've ever been excluded from it, to be honest.
Well, the Australian project started on January 26, 1788. That's when it began, when Governor Arthur Phillip planted the Union Jack on Sydney Cove. Though, if it was the thing about changing the date to say Federation Day. The Invasion Day protesters, or the other thing they call it, is Survival Day, which the fact that the Aboriginals, there's so many of them today, many of them thriving. I mean, they're surviving pretty well today, but they're about abolishing Australia. Most of them would probably support the Black sovereign movement that does, because remember, their slogan is sovereignty was never ceded, always was, always will be. So they don't believe that Australia should exist, that it's worthy of a date. They believe that Australia has a shameful history. And the thing about it, they'll never be satisfied, because when Australia federated, don't forget, that's when the White Australia policy was introduced, one of the first acts of the new federal parliament. So there's bad things that can be said about when Australia federated. I mean, if you had a look at the Voice referendum campaign, apparently modern Australian history only began in 1967 with the dismantlement of the White Australia policy and the constitutional referendum to include Aboriginals in the census. So this is why there should never be an inch given. I couldn't believe on Sky News tonight, Steve Price said, "Oh, because of the protesters in the city, I'm just going to give up and we should change the date." And I was just like, facepalm.
Yep.
Yay!
Just
more Sky News cuckoldry to behold for everyone.
Terrible.
You know.
Yeah.
But remember, I did
see Furious. I did see a news thing where some white Australian dudes with Australian flags were actually banned by the Victorian police from going anywhere near the CBD.
Oh no, sorry, that was Thomas Sully was in Sydney today.
That's in Sydney.
Oh, was it in Sydney? I beg your pardon. I thought it was in Melbourne. I beg your pardon. So it was New South Wales police. Same difference, but yeah.
But yeah,
it's just insane that the majority of people in the country can't fly their flag on their national day in one of their big cities. It's just insane.
I just wanted to remind our friend here, Tim, that we have to remember that the left, the left essentially believed that there was no Australia before Gough Whitlam. Like he's technically our first prime minister.
Well, they credit him with ending the White Australia policy, but it was actually Harold Holt who begun to dismantle it. He also brought in the Australian dollar, so that was the end of the English pound in Australia, and he oversaw that 1967 referendum. But because Harold Holt's a liberal, well, he's more famous for disappearing off Cheviot Beach in Portsea than for what he actually did as Prime Minister.
Yeah,
the only prime minister in the world to disappear off of it.
I was going to say we're such a big and sparse continent. We've even lost our own prime minister.
Just insanity.
Anyway,
I mean, all right, guys, we got to mention this. Like yesterday or last night, people cut down the Captain Cook statue in Melbourne. And they then went and vandalized the Queen Victoria statue and memorial near the Royal Botanic Gardens. And the statue, particularly of Captain Cook, which is in St Kilda. I used to live in St Kilda, and it's like St Kilda police station is about 4 minutes or 5 minutes walk at most from that statue. So in a police car, it would take you like a minute, maybe. And members of the public, as we were told by the mainstream media, called Victoria Police and told them this was happening. And they didn't even bother sending a couple of cops in a police car to go and arrest these people.
Oh, they were just, very slow that they turned up when they'd finished with the angle grinders, dismembering it, decapitating it, and... Yeah, they we still haven't heard any update on the investigation. I'm not holding my breath. I mean,
No.
I believe that there's certainly there would be a lot in Victoria Police, the local council, and the Allen government who would be happy that had happened.
Yes.
I mean, let's remember, Victoria Police, they still haven't arrested anyone for the car bombing of Tim Lutz.
Yeah, that's right. Just before Christmas,
house.
yeah.
I mean, and going back to the statue, I mean, if there ever is a statue of Dan Andrews, like, you can probably guarantee that would get decapitated. But you can imagine PR guy 17 and Dan Fangirl saying, "Oh, this is an act of political violence. What's becoming of our country?" But there were all these on Twitter X, these people excusing it, saying, "Oh, like, aren't there enough statues of James Cook? What? So we can just cut down any statue that we don't like?" I mean, this is the thing.
Yeah.
You could never give an inch on these people. I'm sorry. Furious was completely correct earlier. Every time you give an inch on this, you're giving a mile, because the slippery slope is real.
And very soon you will not have a leg to stand on. But this is the thing where, and we saw this most evidently, or rather, I think the world saw this very clearly in the aftermath of the events around Capitol Hill on Jan 6, right? 2020, and the number of people who were, let's just put it plainly, are innocent, or at the very least have been charged very, very heftily on the most frivolous of bases, right? And these people are essentially rotting in prison, and a number of them without even any charges to speak of, right? They're just essentially in permanent detention, in utter contradiction of the so-called values of which the United States government professes to exist, right? On the very basis of its constitution.
Some of these guys got 20 years.
Absolutely.
Some of those Januaries, and they were invited in, and there's video showing you they were invited in.
Yeah.
By the cops.
Yeah, like they literally like open the red ropes, and they strolled in. And meanwhile, you have an event which occurred, a year prior, 18 months prior, with BLM, or maybe even less, whereby, quite literally speaking, millions, if not billions of dollars of public and private damage and destruction of property took place, where people were assaulted and in some cases murdered in the street. And every Democrat-dominated district attorney and prosecutor's office just threw out case after case after case, and not a single
almost no trial.
Essentially, right? For the most part, nobody has been charged for any of that whatsoever, which actually, unlike what happened on Jan 6, was an insurrection and was actually fueled by a number of left-leaning politicians and journalists and academics, etc. And it goes to show us that people of our ilk need to be extremely aware. And essentially, for those of us, let me put it this way, because I'm sort of in this position myself. I know of quite a few boomers who you might say are based, but sometimes still get suckered into the old talking points. What we might call boomerisms, right? That it's about freedom, and being judgmental is bad, or that sort of thing, right? Like, they have these inherent beliefs that are true, but then sometimes they get sort of dissuaded by some of the presuppositions that they've had instilled in them since childhood. And that is that we have to do our best to encourage these people who are sort of, shall I say, within our sphere of belief or worldview, that firstly, there are no neutral or impartial institutions, right? And secondly, is that we have to look at the world through a Schmittian perspective. And Carl Schmitt was right that he who is sovereign defines the exception. And I refuse to call them people, I will call them creatures who dominate our institutions, who dominate every sort of facet of governance and bureaucracy, not just in Australia, but in the Western world writ large. right? They hate us. They hate who we are. They even hate themselves. And they will never stop, even at doing things that are eminently unjust, eminently unprincipled, and eminently wrong and immoral.
They're evil.
To see through. They are evil. Evil is the correct word.
They're just evil people.
They are 100% evil. And it is, for those of us who know better, it is our place to actually say to people who you might say at least mostly agree with us, or who are sort of to our side of things, hey guys, listen, this belief in neutral institutions is garbage. This belief in, impartial institutions is wrong. Look at this example, look at this example, look at this example. And, even though there's that natural sentiment that exists, like we said, you go out into the suburbia of the country, there are Australian flags and there's patriotism and whatever. But a number of these people still believe in some of these, shall I say, like erroneous principles. Like they'll still be sort of like egalitarian at heart, or they might be kind of, little L liberal at heart or something. It's just like, no, these creatures in control hate us and hate you. It's time you realize.
Yeah, they want you dead, mate. They want us all dead, and everyone who thinks like us all dead. They do. Wilmsfont, you made a comment in the chat there, and would you like to expand on that? Because I don't know what that is, so please.
Yes, so Parliament House in Canberra today was placed into lockdown because there was anti-Australia and anti-Israel, pro-Palestine. This was because remember back in 2020 during COVID, the Black Lives Matter protests in Melbourne, they tried to tried to apply that to Aboriginals. And this is the thing about, you've heard of biopic, Black, Indigenous, people of colour. So it's all about anti-whiteism, protesting against whitey, the oppressive whites. And so because every week now the left having pro-Palestine rallies, they combined the two this year. So Parliament House was placed into lockdown because they were surrounding the front gates, and they were chanting "fuck Australia" and "fuck Israel." And so is that an insurrection? The fact that Parliament was placed into lockdown, though obviously the politicians weren't there. Though going back to 1996, there was an insurrection when trade union thugs broke into Parliament House and trashed the gift shop. So again, this is the January 6th standard, like people going into supposed to be the People's House. But, January 6th, it's worse than 9/11, Pearl Harbor, and the Civil War combined.
I've got to say, Tim, that, I'm entirely neutral about Israel and Palestine. I don't think either of them are our friends.
Yeah, me as well.
But it's got bugger all to do with Australia. Why are you walking around Melbourne or Sydney with Palestinian flags? Go to Palestine if that's what you want to do. Likewise, if you want to walk around with Israeli flags, go to Israel. It's like, what the flipping hell has it got to do with us? Nothing.
Yeah, I would say, Iron Duke, that it's the prerogative of any self-respecting white man or woman, obviously with Lady Charlotte here, that one should not involve themselves with inter-Semitic squabbles. Leave them to themselves.
Yeah,
they deserve each other.
Sort it out. I don't care. I'm neutral on it. But neither of them are my friends. They're not. Are either of them going to come and help Australia if it's in the shit?
Yeah.
No, they're not. So,
And what's an interesting dynamic too is that, for instance, there'll be people who will say of an Islamic background, or Arabs, for instance, who will sort of rightly point out, interests that are on the other side, and they're accurate in saying so. But then they'll come to Australia, that they'll protest in Melbourne or Sydney, or they'll protest in London or Manchester, and denigrate us in our own homeland. And it's a case of, you want us to be your friends, and then you come to our home, you denigrate us, you agitate to change our laws, and then when something disastrous happens in your homeland, which I will say this quite plainly, what's occurring in Gaza at the moment is absolutely horrendous and abominable, right? but you have the goal.
Well, if Russia was doing it, it would be.
Oh my God!
Furious.
Mate, the paper printers would be smoking at the seams. All the bearings would be blowing out because they wouldn't be stopping, right? But you know, it is disastrous what's happening there. But then there are people of that extraction or who share those sympathies, then come here and sort of say, oh well, you know, whites are X and you are colonizers, and you know these laws need to change, and these things are right and wrong about Western society. Like, well, I'm not in Riyadh, I'm not in Baghdad or whatever, criticizing Islam or your civilization or your culture, right? Because like that's your home. If you want to be there, you know, good luck to you, like all the best. And I mean, you know, I say this as a classicist, Iron Duke, is that some of those Eastern civilizations actually have a great history. Some of them are very, very interesting. And some of them, you know, have achieved heights of culture that most other people in the world would envy, right? So I don't say this lightly, but in the end, every culture and people and groups of people have something corresponding to a homeland. And if you want to live by your own laws and your own customs, you have a right to do that, right? But it is the case that they will come to the West and then like denigrate us, and then a disaster happens in the Middle East. It's like, oh my God, feel sorry for us. It's like, well, does it really work that way? Is this really reciprocal?
Yeah,
you know,
exactly.
And the other team, and in fairness, the other team do it as well. The other team do it as well. So I don't want to sound like I'm just bashing Arabs.
No, absolutely.
Yeah, it works both ways.
Furious. Like I said, I'm neutral on Palestine, Israel. I think they're both as bad as one another, and really not our business, you know. But what I would say is this: I am not against Israel having an ethno-state. I'm not against Palestine having an ethno-state. I'm not against anyone having an ethno-state if that's what they want. But certain people, right, of certain groups, and it's not just small hats, but it's other groups as well, and also certain traitors on our own side. Everybody else is not allowed an ethno-state.
Well, white Europeans aren't allowed an ethno-state.
For some reason.
Yeah. Our institutions, our homelands are for everybody.
Only white Europeans are not allowed it. You can be a proud Zulu, you can be a proud Jew, Israeli, you can be a proud Palestinian,
Sri Lankan or Burmese or whatever.
Indonesian, Indian, you Chinese, you name it, but not any sort of European descent white people. Never, ever, ever. We're the only people who are not allowed that, which is, to me, fairly obvious now.
Precisely.
You know, like diversity is just left speak for anti-white. That's all it means.
Of course.
Actually, sorry, in the comments, William Turner put it quite aptly, actually. Ethnostate for me, melting pot for thee. And it's so true.
Yeah.
And on this specific point, right, I just want to sort of say this, and then I'll step 100%. Back, is that when people do not recognize this, they fit into one of three categories. They are either too much of a coward to admit it, they are either so naive is that they cannot see the forest for the trees and will not recognize danger when it's apparent, or they are an outright complicit traitor batting for the other side. A person who does not see the obvious fits into one of those three categories with no exception.
100%, mate. Totally agree with that. Totally agree with that. And I tell you what, 6 years ago, I probably might not have, because I hadn't woken up enough even 6 years ago. And I'm an old fella, like, you know, I'm 58 years old.
Don't be so hard on yourself, Iron Duke.
No, I am. I'm an old fella. I'm 58 years old, mate. But I was just like recently involved in this stuff that you guys would have seen on Twitter, where they were starting to speak about, Britain should introduce conscription. And I was pointing out, like, I joined the British Army as an 18-year-old lad in the early 1980s. And I did 2 tours in Northern Ireland, which Lady Charlotte knows about because that's where her family comes from. And it was, you know, it wasn't a full-on war like Ukraine, but a lot of people got killed.
I mean, hence they called the Troubles, right?
And children.
Yeah,
I mean,
the
hence
Troubles.
It's called the Troubles, you know.
Yeah. But I could not, in all honesty, advise any young man today in Britain or Australia to join the armed forces to go and fight for globalist governments that hate you and want you gone. As European white people, they do. They want you gone.
You're not fighting for your country. You end up fighting for a regime that is hostile to you and your interests. And ultimately, I'll do my best to dissuade any self-respecting white young lad from doing so. It is not in your interest to do so.
Look, listen, I think any self-respecting white young lad should fight for his people, you know, and his family.
Totally, his homeland, his country,
which is what everyone traditionally did. But today, if you fight for the British government or the Australian government or the American government or the Canadian government or the New Zealand government, you're not fighting for your own people. You're fighting against them for the large part.
Correctly. Exactly
you're
right.
Fighting for the globalists. Like, again, going back to the Sky News neocon cringe conservatives. I mean, they're going off because the Albanese government doesn't want to send to Ukraine our useless Taipan helicopters that have killed Australian servicemen. They're like, oh, we should still send them. And I'm sort of thinking, what? So more Ukrainians can die, except in that situation, they wouldn't be killed by Russia. They'd just be killed by a faulty aircraft. But they're still like banging on the Sky After Dark neocons about this. And they're also in their Australia Day defense, and all of the most of the Liberal Party politicians like this, you know, we should celebrate Australia as one of the most successful multicultural countries, and they always make this big thing about how new migrants they embrace Australia Day, implying even more than natives. And of course,
no, they don't.
The big
no, they don't.
They don't.
The Liberals made the big point this year that Albanese has reversed our ban on councils moving their citizenship ceremonies from January 26. And I made the point on my show, do we really need more new Australians?
I mean, especially, Tim, you know, Australia is a huge continent. It's, for anyone who's watching this who's not an Aussie, Australia is basically as large as the United States, minus Alaska. All right? It's that big. But the middle of Australia is like desert, and much of it is desert and semi-desert.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Basically, 70% of the interior is Arizona and New Mexico. More or less.
Exactly. It is. Yeah. And even worse in some places. Absolutely for Europe.
Yeah.
But so Australia is this huge place, but it's only really habitable mostly around the edges. All right. You can build a town like Alice Springs and that sort of stuff, but mostly Australia is habitable around the edges because the middle of it is either desert or semi-desert, and there's only so much you can do with that. And you know, water is an issue for Australia, and you get these people, you know, the World Economic Forum types and other globalists who support that sort of thing, who talk about Australia having a population like twice what it is now, but they never talk about where is the water and the food and all the rest of this going to come for Australia, particularly if you introduce all these ridiculous green policies of like no fossil fuels, and we rely on wind power and solar
no
power.
New dams either.
Yep, no new dams. Exactly.
Hey, but remember,
insanity.
But remember, on that basis, and Tim, you might have to help me here because I've just forgotten his name. Flannery, that idiot
Flannery.
Environmentalist, Tim Flannery. Thank you. You know, after I think it was just before the massive Queensland floods, when was it like 2009 or 2010, whatever it was. He's like, "There's no point building dams because we'll never have large rains again." And then within like 2 years of his statement, half of Queensland and the top portion of New South Wales was inundated under this sort of essentially what was like an inland lake for like several months. And we've had massive rain events in places such as, northern Queensland, because I mean, they always get the tropical cyclones. That's happening right now even. We've had big rains in West Australia. In fact, WA
here in Victoria, Diamora in Gippsland, massive floods.
Absolutely. And not this last harvest just gone, but the 3 harvests before, WA had 3 bumper harvests, which was a result of very, very consistent and strong rainfalls that sort of coincide with the growing season. And I mean, we were told this was never going to happen. We were just told this continent was going to shrivel up into like a dusty piece of bark and just vanish into the ether. And we're sort of told these lies by these people who have an agenda. Meanwhile, there are actual tangible infrastructure shortages, and even in terms of when you have X number of people, you essentially need X number of doctors, you need X number of nurses, you need X number of power stations, you need X number of goods and services, even things like taxi drivers, or like all these sort of peripheral things that sort of make a society function and grease the wheels of life, so to speak, right? All these things have been in shortfall for however long, and we just keep bringing increasing torrents of people into this country where we just, we can't even service our existing citizens as they are. And I don't know about Melbourne, because I've been in Melbourne for a couple of years now. But I mean, I've seen, because I've traveled. Actually, that's a lie. I was in Melbourne last year, but I've traveled between sort of Melbourne, Brisbane, and Perth, and I see an increasing number of homeless people. I hear a lot of chatter about people struggling, and people who've come out of COVID who have businesses who are struggling to get back on their feet. And then meanwhile, it's just open slather. There's billions of dollars for Ukraine. There's billions of dollars for these Pacific Island countries. There's billions of dollars for Indonesia to keep their halal abattoirs open so that we can send our beef to be processed over there rather than giving our own butchers jobs. And then we're just at this open floodgate. It is so nonsensical and stupid. And just to touch on the Sky News thing, because it is true, it's a part of the problem, is you get people who are, and I'm doing sort of like the commas with my fingers here, so-called conservatives or so-called right-wingers, who basically buy into liberal presupposition, left-wing presuppositions. Oh, well, I believe in freedom and I believe in a fair go and anyone could be an Australian. And it's like, these things are nonsensical. And if you have someone who says that they're right-wing, professing those beliefs, they are not. They are a left-winger in camouflage. It's important to know.
Look, my own opinion is that someone can become an Australian if they live in Australia, they love Australia, and they adapt to its values. But most third world people won't. They just won't, because Australia is a Western country.
As the token med on this channel, I even say this to my own friends, I consider myself less of an Australian than Anglo-Australians, even though I was born here, and even though, and I think it's fair to say that rural people have a special relationship with the land that they come from, right? It's just like, no, like I am not an Anglo-Saxon. I'm not a child of Britain. Therefore, I have a different relationship, and it's worth mentioning.
Furious, could I just say, look, I know you come from an Italian background, right? And Wilm, I think, comes from a German background originally. Yes. And Lady Charlotte is from Northern Ireland, which is a very loyalist part of Britain, by the way. But anyway, so, Australians come from various places. They always have. I think they've always mostly been Anglo-Celtic. But I don't see any reason why, like someone from Europe, like yourself or Wilm, can't live in Australia, and especially for several generations. And then, you're more Australian than me. Me, I still call myself an Englishman who lives in England, who lives in Australia. Because I was born in England, I lived in England.
I just think the legacy people deserve
for 15 years, and then I ended up moving to Australia after that.
But let's even sort of flip this around a little bit. Let's just say, for example, I came to Britain, right? All my parents moved to Britain, and then I was born in, Bath, or I was born in Bristol or something, right? And I'm a first generation English Italian. Mm-hmm. It'd be me saying to you, like, okay, I am sort of English in the technical sense, or I'm British in the sense of citizenship or whatever, and I can agree with its its identity and its presuppositions, and I can uphold its legacy. But I am not as British as someone who's been born of this land for 1,000 years. And the problem is with egalitarians is that all those distinctions evaporate for the sake of ideological necessity. And it's important that people like us who have a structured and objective worldview have those distinctions. You know, and that's not to say that I'm not patriotic or that I don't believe in the interests of this country or that I'm not prepared to fight for it in a sense. But, you know, we shouldn't have any shame or any problem in being able to say that yeah, like, yes, I am, you know, to a certain point or to some certain degree, less of an than someone whose parents were here when, or sorry, whose ancestors were here when Federation occurred, or whose, you know, whose ancestors fought in World War I and World War II. And then in that being said, I am thus more Australian than someone who arrived here to come to university 10 years ago. Like, these things are just structured and they're sensible, but that discussion cannot be had. And there are a lot of people who don't want to have that discussion out of bad faith.
Yeah, totally agree, man. Australia in the chat, and I've just put this up because I know Australia, and well, I know him online, but he says Australia is not a European nation, not at all. Well, it really is in terms of the people who actually made it. I would say Australia.
Central
the people who made Australia were Europeans. They were. I'm sorry, they were.
Central Europeans, which includes Germans, a lot of them arrived in the 19th century to colonial Australia. The southern Europeans, the Greeks and Italians, a lot of they came en masse after the Second World War. So obviously early in the from the 18th century, it was obviously, we still have the Union Jack in our flag. So that's the British created the Australian project, but it was built by people from other European countries and ethnicities. But I would say
Tim, I would say, Tim, though, look, I am at least as much into military history as Furious is. And like, there were Australian volunteers who went and fought in the Maori Wars in the 19th century. And at least one of those guys was a German guy who'd moved to Australia and then went and fought in the Maori Wars for the Brits. You know? Yeah, absolutely. I don't have a problem with that at all myself. I do have a problem with this statement. And you know what? I know Furious. I've known him for quite a long time online. He's a very good man. And I'm sorry, I just don't agree with you. And also, if you're going to look at the start of Western civilization, you can't really not look at the Greeks and the Romans. But that's my final thought on that.
If I can just touch that point as well, that comment. And Alan, I actually kind of thought you would agree. What I'm essentially saying is that people of British stock who came here, like people who came here as convicts, or people who here was, came to the settler colonies, to the Swan River colony, to the, to Botany Bay, to Tasmania, to Adelaide, right? And people who thus arrived subsequently from that point, and whose families were a real part of the foundation of this country, whose ancestors would have fought in the Boer Wars, World War I, World War II, have a right to call themselves legacy Australians. I am a person who's not of that extraction saying that. I'm essentially supporting the idea that legacy Australians should have a preeminent or prominent place insofar of having, shall I say, the closest tie to the identity of this country. I don't know why you take umbrage with that. I mean, a lot of people who have your point of view say, oh, these, foreigners don't, care about Australians or care about Australia or its heritage. I'm actually saying the opposite thing. So I don't know why you're taking contention with it. And anyway, that's neither here nor there.
Yeah, I don't know. I think we get mixed up sometimes, Furious.
I think sometimes
one of my
happens incidentally.
One of my grandfather's brothers was killed by Afrika Korps counterbattle. He was in the Royal Artillery, and he was killed by Afrika Korps counter battery fire in World War II. All right.
Mm-hmm.
So what? You know, they were just fighting each other. And you know, one of the things that does annoy me is that so many people, especially on the right, to be honest, will say that the guys in World War II were cucks. They weren't. Like,
No,
not the Brits.
I don't take that view.
Yeah, no, I don't either. Not the Brits weren't cucks. The Australians weren't cucks. The Germans weren't cucks. The Italians weren't cucks. The Russians weren't. Nobody was. All of those people in World War II were, and I'm talking about the ordinary soldiers and like the regimental officers. All of those people were nationalists. All of them.
And
that includes the Americans as well.
Yeah.
All of them.
To be honest, I even include the Soviets in that. I mean, as much as I, as an anti-Bolshevik, hate to say it, if you look at the way in which the Soviet soldier fought in World War II, and you got to think, with its own political officers holding submachine guns to their own backs, right?
Yep.
Whilst fighting arguably the most potent military force the world has seen, which is, you know, a fully strength Wehrmacht can be argued to be one of the greatest armies ever seen, right? And they fought with great courage and great determination as a result of that. And I think that it is one thing to say this, right? If I can just sort of self-quote, I suppose, is that, yes, the American and British servicemen, their efforts brought about the rise of what we in our circles call the GAE, right? The global sort of Anglo-American empire or whatever, or the, you know, the globalists, whatever. But they were firstly none the wiser. And secondly, in most instances, they were conscripted or were going to be pressed into service somehow and essentially had an alternative than to fight. And if you look at the information that was available to them, right, and the way in which and this isn't just World War II, this is actually both wars, right? In the way in which they were published in terms of newspapers and radio, a lot of men, either rightly or wrongly, believed to have been doing their patriotic duty sincerely. And I think that should be seen in context. And I don't think it's fair for people who, let's just say, the vast majority of us, either on this panel or listening, are lesser grade quality men than probably our, you know, certainly, or maybe our parents, but certainly our grandfathers and great grandfathers or great grandparents, right? And many of their ilk paid a very, very, very dear price, either being maimed or wounded or mentally scarred or whatever from the experiences of those two world wars and what arose out of them, you know, the Great Depression and, you know, the Spanish flu and all that, right? That people like us should spare a thought for them. And it's also a part of the reason why, I mean, you know, boomers and silent generation are a little bit different. But in the same way that we can look at, say, Gen Xers, millennials, and Zoomers and whatever, it's like, oh, you know, they bought into the regime, they bought into the lies, they've been brainwashed and whatever. And there are many, many deeply subversive and the multi-vectored nature of it is apparent. And only those of us who are aware to this can see it and know about it. Is that the silent generation and the boomers were the first generation to really receive that treatment. They were the ones that really were the first generations to be bombarded with, you know, ideological subversion and demoralization. And you know, it was that generation that, you know, was really the first generation to be raised with, you know, cinema at a wide scale, radio, television. And you know, I'm just saying, we need to
I don't disagree with you.
Yeah,
I think you're totally right.
Yeah.
I really do. I don't disagree with you at all. I think you're totally right.
I'm just saying that people like us should spare a thought for that. You know, that just to be cognizant of it because it's easy to overlook. Is what I'm saying.
100%, man. 100%. I think you're totally right. But I would like to see what Lady Charlotte and Tim thought of this.
I do. I concur with both of you. And going back to the discussion what you mentioned before, Iron Duke, about the head of the British Army talking about, we may need to bring back conscription. I mean, this is where we're at these days. There's a generation that won't fight.
They won't fight.
And probably can't fight. And that wasn't the case 100 years ago. I mean, the Anzac, Anzac's, well, you could call it legend, spirit, whatever word you want to use. It was because there was when we learnt about it, is that there was no shortage of volunteers to fight in World War One.
That's right. Yeah, absolutely.
And the Australians were extremely popular in Britain back in those days. You know, like extremely so. It was like the thing that it was kind of put in the way that these are our sons, you know, with the Australians and the Canadians and the New Zealanders. These are our sons coming back to fight for us. Now, don't get me wrong. I think the original sin of the British Empire was joining World War One in 1914, and even more so in raising a mass army against all British military tradition. You know, Britain's military tradition is a navy, not an army. So yeah, but yeah, the soldiers from Australia and Canada and New Zealand and South Africa, it has to be said, the white South African soldiers were extremely popular in Britain in the First World War and indeed in the Second World War. So yeah.
But you're just not going to be able to sell that to people now. I mean, you can't say England expects every man to do his duty. To do what? To fight for Pakistani rapists and Somali 4-star hotel dwellers? No way. I've looked at some of these articles and I've read the comments underneath, and every one of them is just, I'm not sending my man to fight for dinghy divers. No way. I'm not doing it. Not one. Not one.
Pretty much what I said on my Twitter.
I wonder why that general I don't know what you guys think about it. I wonder why he made that statement. What's going on there?
He made that statement because the British Army has never been smaller and weaker in its entire history. The British Army is ridiculous. You could if you put the British Army, the whole British Army, including all the gay people and all the women, into Wembley Stadium would be nowhere near filled. The idea that we could fight a serious war from Britain is ridiculous. And trust me, the Australian army is even weaker than that. But
Britain can't even defend the English Channel. The same goes
for the Navy. The Royal Navy has never been smaller and weaker than it is today. Never. And again, the same goes for Australia. Well, all of our Western nations are not capable of defending ourselves without very serious American aid. None of us are.
And even the American armed forces are faltering at this point. Sorry, Tim, I didn't mean to interrupt you, but take that into account as well. Like, the Americans can't do the heavy lifting that they used to. They're going to struggle to fulfill their own needs.
Their recruitment targets.
Precisely.
No, nowhere near, because Southern white boys ain't joining the American army. Well, what a surprise when you're told that white boys are the most evil thing in the whole entire universe, which is what we're all constantly told in every single Western nation, including Australia.
And your president orders that the border wall be cut so that illegals can flock in.
Totally correct, Tim. Totally correct. I did say to somebody before we started this stream, gents, I did say to somebody I would give him a plug in the middle of the stream, so I'm going to do it. If I can possibly get it to load. There we go. This is from someone called Colonel Pride Review, and it's his video on the early history of Australia, and it isn't too terrible. Go watch it. Anyway, sorry, that was my intervention. I beg your pardon, gents. Carry on.
I was going to say, yeah, the other thing too, because I mean, you know, you're a man who's obviously steeped in understanding of the British military history and the British Armed Forces sort of by and large. And there was probably once a time where the Royal Navy would have had insufficient ships for all of its personnel. And you got to think not just mariners and sailors, but also naval reservists and whatever. I mean, you got to think this was at a point in time where the Royal Navy had a doctrine of having a greater strength than its next two powers combined, the next two following powers combined, right? That was the operating military of the British Navy for what, at least 2 or 3 centuries, right? And now the British are mothballing, or at the very least not putting to sea, vessels that are combat ready and worthy due to insufficient personnel. It's inverted itself for 100%. It's amazing to consider.
Look, I don't want to make this a history, but I will just say this. In 1982, the Royal Navy had over 70 frigates and destroyers. You know, 1982 was the time of the Falklands War, as you well know, Furious. Over 70 frigates and destroyers. Today, the Royal Navy has 16 frigates and destroyers.
Oof.
In 1982, the Royal Navy had at least 12 SSN nuclear-powered hunter-killer submarines. Today, the Royal Navy has 6, and actually, I think it's 5, to be honest, that are really operational.
God, they can hardly defend the channel.
Well, they can't defend the channel, but I have to say, Furious, I get niggled with Brits who keep saying the Royal Navy can't defend this channel. The Royal Navy is not told to defend the channel, as you well know. All right?
Indeed, I'm being facetious, but I get your point.
You don't need a warship.
I think people who are saying that, they're making the point about
you don't need
national defense.
Yeah, exactly. They could defend it, but they're not instructed to, so they don't.
Yeah, they're told not to. And you know, do you think a Royal Navy captain can go against what the government and the Ministry of Defence tells him? And if they did, would he survive in his command? No.
Alan has mentioned in the chat AUKUS. I mean, the Australian media has spoken about these nuclear submarines that we're spending billions on not going to get for decades. And like Australia's defence procurement, I mentioned those Type N helicopters, which crashed and killed some of our servicemen. Australia has a terrible history of defence procurement, and we've got this AUKUS, which is it's spoken about like it's right now. These nuclear submarines are not arriving for decades.
That's right, decades. And meantime, Albanese has promised to support Ukraine for as long as it takes. So that's our taxes going overseas to that complete black hole.
Yeah, Rishi Sunak was just there.
Ukraine a vital Australian interest? What? Tell me, guys, why is Ukraine a vital Australian interest? I mean, you could also tell me why it's a vital British interest, or even a vital American interest, really. But why on earth is it a vital Australian interest?
Well, you can say the same about Israel. It's because these
you sure can.
Conservative talk channels, they like to talk in the context of the philosophical battle of civilization. So you get
Judeo-Christian values, right?
Yeah,
Tim?
people like Douglas Murray and Constantine
Thyssen
always talking about this is it's a battle for our civilization. They sit in their studios talking about this, although Douglas Murray does cosplay as a Israeli war correspondent. They talk about it as we're battling for the values, and we've got to make a stand against these tyrants. It's the Churchillian. They want to talk in these terms, that they always, and Zelensky, he wants to be the Churchill, that never give in, never surrender, good always prevails over evil,
and
Churchill.
Tim, just to buttress you, it's always couched in this kind of like, oh, the other is like barbarism or darkness or evil, and we're the good guys, like every time, right?
Correct.
Yes, that's how they're mainly News Corp channels. So like Sky News Australia, so it's Talk TV over there. GB News, even though it got rid of Lawrence Fox and Mark Stein and Calvin Robertson, it's still much more okay than Talk TV.
Anyone speaking?
Many such cases, right? But yeah, no, Tim's quite right. Actually, I do agree with his position on that. And it sort of seems to be that it's like the Norm Macdonald meme that, oh wow, we've been the good guys every time. Imagine that. What are the odds? Just to answer your question, Iron Duke, as well. I suppose just to attach to what Tim was saying is that, it's one of those things where if as much as I'm kind of half joking, I'm obviously also half serious, that why Ukraine matters to a country like ours is because the Kiev regime is essentially an asset of the US State Department and the Pentagon, and by extension, the United Kingdom exists as a buttress to the American sort of global project, as does Australia. So if you sort of draw that string long enough, it does matter, but for all the wrong reasons. It matters to creatures who
get
the State Department, who are very, very evil people.
Furious, I do get it.
Oh no, I know you get it. I'm saying it's more for our audience's benefit, but yeah. It's like basically fight and die for Victoria Newland.
1956, when UK and France wanted to take over the Suez Canal zone, suddenly America didn't like that much. But there are special relationship allies. Bullshit, are they? Sorry.
Actually, you should highlight that. You should highlight that comment by Timo Varminius, because it's so true. As Australians, we should always cringe when we hear this talk of greatest allies. Actually, Australia is probably, if you really, really think about it, the longest and most enduring and most loyal of American allies. And when American elites say otherwise, they're being very disingenuous and very disrespectful to the Australian servicemen who have fought and died alongside their American brothers in arms. Very good comment, actually, Tim Varminius. 100% agree.
The other Pee-wee say, man, Iron Duke loves to interrupt. Laughing out loud. Do you know what? I was really bad for that when I first started streaming, which was a long.
Oh, it's your stream, so
don't do it so much.
You can...
Your channel, your realm,
your channel, your rules.
We believe in hierarchy in the right wing, so it's his channel.
No, guys. I used to be terrible. Yeah, but I used to be terrible for this when I first started this channel. It's nowhere near as bad now. I kind of shut up most of the time, but anyway.
Can I just change the subject for a bit, because Tim's put in our private chat here. Tim's raised the issue of what happened in Sydney today, and one thing that you can say about Victoria is that it has quite a strong dissident right, and some of that dissident right were in Sydney today, the NSN. And I'm wondering what the panel, do you guys think that the message of Tom Sewell and his supporters is actually filtering through to the mainstream? I mean, I don't know what Tim thinks of that, because Tim and I have encountered Tom Sewell. We saw him at the Let Women Speak Posy event. I made a video on that on my channel. Tim was there. That was last March. I'm wondering, Tim, do you think that their message is getting through to the mainstream in Australia at all?
In advancing national socialism, I don't think so. But certainly, I defend their right to free speech and to raise their hands if they wish, but that gets you 12 months jail now.
Yeah.
I'm not sure if we're going to get into a whole discussion about Tom and the NSN's decision to promote national socialism and Australian nationalism. Like, I certainly don't agree with national socialism. I'm very libertarian in my views. But going back to today, like, obviously the Victoria police, they have aggressively moved them off the steps of Parliament House.
Yes.
And I know that Tom and the NSN refer to Victoria Police as the uphold the anal sex. But so it seems like they went up to Sydney to sort of see how the New South Wales Police would.
Which they
do.
As
far as what I've seen is that the NSN, they got from one train station to the next, and New South Wales Police were already onto them. And remember last year they went to Ballarat for the...
That's right. Yeah, they did. They did.
Okay, that's an hour and a half from Melbourne. They weren't... The Victoria Police, they obviously were watching, but allowed them. But today it seems like they've been watching the New South Wales Police for quite a while. It seemed that the surveillance was very much onto them. And the fact that they were given that move on order, that they weren't allowed to go to any Australia Day celebrations.
That's right. There was celebrations.
Tom hasn't, I don't think, published the move on order, but Tom was saying, does that include like at a pub? Like, because that's a public place. Pub stands for public. Like, if it has an Australia Day themed like celebration, someone singing a song and that, are they like, and does that apply to the whole of New South Wales? The fact, because they were banned from the city of Sydney, but the fact that I was unaware that was like, you could have a move on order from like essentially a certain type of activity for 24 hours for the entire day.
Yeah, it's just really interesting, isn't it? Because a number of British people have said to me, but it's great that you've got that group there, and you do have a dissident right, but I just wonder how much of their message gets through just to the general populace.
And also the Black Bloc, like, I would say they need to reconsider that, given that the mainstream media was able to put out headlines today, balaclava, dressed men, held on a North Sydney train. The police say there's no ongoing threat to the public. I mean, I got that alert, and I didn't twig at the time that it was NSN, but obviously I did later on. But a normie would get that news alert from Sky News Australia again and say, "Oh, what's going on there? That sounds very concerning." Like, I would sort of think, why couldn't NSN maybe dress up in Australian flags that day?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. It's in, they certainly they always make news. They make news.
People slag off liberty. Sorry, Lady.
No, I was just going to say that
I was just
Tom Sewell lives rent free in the heads at Channel 9 and Channel 7. They love him. I think that the mainstream media in Australia would be lost without the NSN. Yeah, they love them.
They feature in Sky News Australia's promo for this year, like on like big news events. There's a feature of them marching, and it's like,
Yeah, they make news.
All I would say to this is that, like, Tim is pretty much a libertarian as far as I can work out. I think he's a right-wing libertarian, but he is a libertarian. And many libertarians are slagged off by people on the right. But I think Tim has a pretty healthy attitude to this kind of thing. And it's the truth. Like, you know, white blokes waving Australian flags are not allowed in big Australian seas on Australia Day. I mean, come on, something's going wrong there, boys. You know, it's just going wrong. And at least Tim calls that out, which is good for him.
It is worth saying that if you look... So sorry, Tim, you go. I'll go after you. Sorry, mate.
Yeah, well, back in Australia Day 2019, Ricky Turner, who's the 2AC of Cook's Convicts, he was almost lynched by the anti-Australia mob at Flinders Street Station. Victoria Police dragged him away for his safety. Then the next year, Neil Erickson, who's the 1IC of Cook's Convicts, went to Flinders Street Station with the same flag. This was 2020, and was removed by Victoria Police from the steps. So this was in, and this is why I assume that Tom and the NSN tried Sydney, because Melbourne has been a no-go zone for Australian flags for years. And I remember last Australia Day, the Invasion Day mob in their rampage, they saw this Thai lady wearing an Australian flag top, and they got the megaphone into her face and said, "Shame," because, you know, she's a person of colour traitor to them.
Right, I remember you covered that on your show last year.
I think for this topic, it's worth just, you know, and I mean this is as a general sort of appraisal, you know, for those of us in our spheres who look at these instances, and, you know, I think context and perspective is always important. And when we sort of mention, because Lady Charlotte, you're sort of saying like, oh, they're getting cut through in Australia. I think we always have to appreciate that as historical phenomena, the idea of, say, like the rise of fascism in Europe, in Italy, obviously, because it started there with Mussolini and the black shirts, and then, you know, you have the rise of the NSDAP in Germany in the 30s, that they win the 33 election, and then you have the Spanish Civil War in 36. Is that these are products of their time. And they arose out of a certain set of circumstances amongst certain groups of people who thought a particular way and had a very particular opposition as well. And what's interesting is, with the exception of Oswald with Mosley in England, and that was quite a nascent, a cohesive movement, but quite nascent, and was crushed by the regime in Britain in the 30s and lead up to World War II. But, you know, I think it's one of those things that just the Anglo mindset is a little bit different from, say, its continental German or its Italian or even its Greek counterpart or its Spanish counterpart. I think the Anglosphere does have a different kind of cognizance when it comes to politics, which is not to say that there isn't a place for a sincere or a genuine right wing. Absolutely not. And do I think... you know, and what's interesting is that, you know, when it comes to Sewell and the NSN, is that they're a relatively small group of people, but they absolutely terrify the living daylights out of anybody who sits in anyone who sits in a like a skyscraper that works for a news company, right? And these sort of academic, you know, nobodies who, you know, La Trobe University or, you know, Swinburne or wherever. You know, who sort of see them quite literally as the Antichrist, which is sort of, you know, amusing. But, you know, I think it's worth saying that, because you also made the point, Lady Charlotte, that it's a very powerful movement, or we're not very powerful, but there's a strong dissident environment in Victoria, which is interesting because
it comes across that there is. I think
there has been for a decade, and the National Socialist Network is just the most prominent at this time. I mean, obviously, Melbourne was the birthplace of the United Patriots Front, the True Blue Crew. I mentioned Cook's Convicts. There's a whole bunch of other nationalist patriot groups I could mention. But I will mention that this dissident right emerged soon after Dan Andrews became premier, which shows that if you have when there is this you have a hard left socialist cultural Marxist, of course there's going to be the strongest reaction into the
every action has every action has a reaction. So
Tim,
that makes sense.
you just read my mind, because that's the point I was exactly going to make, is that Victoria obviously is an epicenter of this, leftist mindset carried out by someone as leftist radical like Dan Andrews is, and and not just him. You got to think there's this whole body of apparatchiks and functionaries underneath him. Essentially, like people have commented here about Vicpol. I mean, they did his bidding during lockdown, right?
Legacy lives on in that he's been basically been able to stack the public service, the police, judiciary with all of these far left people, and that's why you're able to get successful prosecutions.
100%. 100%.
Exactly. And the reason I raised the history of these movements in Europe, a couple of minutes ago, is that it's when it gets extremely perilous is when you get cut through, and whether that cut through is effective in the long term or not, or whether it leads to a change of course or not, is another thing entirely. But the point that that I'm trying to make is that, whilst things chug along and things are, pretty, decent and whatever, there isn't the motivation for action. There's not the motivation for people to, do something about it, or to at least make their voices heard. But because Victoria, things are as bad as they are, and for anyone who might remember what Melbourne was like 20, 30 years ago, it was a very different place to what it is now. It still had many of its foibles and its problems that it has today, but it was a lot less of a worse place than what it is now. And the thing is, it is these, and history proves this time and again, is that whenever you have a situation that is, quite terrible, often the counterforce to it will arise. And this is why this strong dissident influence does exist in Melbourne and Victoria. I think Tim and Lady Charlotte have touched on this and are very true to the point.
I tell you something, Gareth, and this is something that Franklin told me on a stream long ago. In 1900, Australia had almost 100 pianos per 1,000 of its population.
I remember seeing this not long ago on Twitter.
Yeah. It's the true story. In 1900, Australia, which was a relatively young country in terms of the Western world, had 100 pianos for every 1,000 of its population, which is extremely high, and then we had Australian cultural icons like Dame Nellie Melba, who was an opera singer, and Australia was really advancing quite quickly in terms of Western civilization. People they just do.
Yeah,
they underestimate. I mean, you've got this, I don't know, world idea of Crocodile Dundee, let's say, who has actually really been dead in Australia for decades now. But in terms of rural Australians, and you would know the term ringers, which is basically an Australian cowboy, really.
Yeah.
And this sort of thing was, and still to some extent does go on. So, the vast majority of the Australian population always lived in Sydney and Melbourne, with a bit more of it in
we're one of the most urbanized countries in the world.
Mostly it was Sydney and Melbourne, a bit more.
The results from the last census showed that 88% of the population of Australia is urbanised. So, and nearly half the population live in Melbourne and Sydney. So yeah, it's a
That does
country.
surprise
Everyone
me.
But
lives
if
in the
you
city.
get out of those cities and you go to little towns and the villages of Australia, and there are many villages in Australia in like the outback, and there are many of the big cities, and you go to the small towns and the villages of Australia, particularly in the outback and in the bush, there's still a real Australia going on. It's just like it gets no representation whatsoever in the mainstream media.
Though
No.
it's not growing, and a lot of them are dying, which is like, obviously they all have rich histories. They're still going because they're already established. But because I mainly road trip these days when I go traveling, like when I went to South Australia at the beginning of the year, like when you go through some of these towns, they're just sort of just going through. There are towns that are just going through the motions. Obviously, they have a rich history, but you don't see them having a great future.
Yeah, because you need children, you need families with young children, and if you don't have that, it just dies. If it's just old people, well, they just die eventually.
Yeah, and you've got to have shops and businesses and to keep these things going.
The other thing is, and this is something I touched on. It was the first stream I ever did with Academic Agent, if I remember. It would be nearly 2 years ago now. I think it was like late 2021 thereabouts. And I sort of touched on the because obviously it affects me and my family and a lot of people that we know. We touched on sort of agriculture and the fate of Australian agriculture and the fact that so much of our prime farmland is being essentially there's this act of predatory capitalism against Australian farmland and pastoral country and station country that's being bought by foreigners, hand over fist. Two of my dad's former neighbors have been bought by foreigners in the last 18 months. So, take that for what it's worth. But the fact of the matter is I sort of touched on more the socio-cultural dynamic of this, and that is that there's been this cycle. I mean, and I know this because I've lived through it and I've watched my peers go through it, is that, there came a time, and this you could say this bracket of history is sort of somewhere from the 60s till about the 90s, right? Where these towns, these rural, centers, and I'm talking like places that are large enough to sort of have like a school that goes from grade 1 to grade 12, right? They're the kind of place that will have a public library, kind of place that will have like, say, 3 or 4 fuel stations, and a couple of cricket grounds and a couple of sporting clubs. Like I'm talking population centers of say 5,000 plus, right? That sort of have enough population to justify public infrastructure and that sort of stuff. Right?
You're not talking about now Outback Village, I get it.
I'm not talking like
about regional Australia.
Yeah, exactly, Tim. Like regional Australian hubs, you might say, right? And these places have been on decline for a relatively long time. Because if you look at the start of the previous century, right, Kalgoorlie wasn't actually a whole lot smaller than Perth, right? During the gold rush era, I know because I actually did some uni work on this, right? And then just sort of over time, Perth has exploded over the last 100 years, and Kalgoorlie has kind of waxed and waned with its mining fortunes. But because of its remoteness and its inaccessibility to water, it just essentially can't grow any bigger. And the things that made it lucrative back in the gold rush days just aren't. In terms of like entrepreneurship and business venturing, unless you're a corporation, you can't really exploit it anymore. It's not like one bloke starting like a business and then sort of makes, a killing on the back of the gold rush. Like, that doesn't really happen anymore, right? But all these centers have been sort of in gradual decline since the 60s. And we've seen this atrophy insofar of, a lot more public monies has been spent in the cities, because obviously that's where the votes are, that's where the electorates are. So politicians are inclined, or even political parties are inclined to, shall we call pork barrel these urban seats that will garner votes and the country seats less so. And then as infrastructure sort of withers and there's sort of atrophy, you get, say, aspirational families. And I mean, I'd sort of categorize my own parents in this situation. It's like, oh, well, listen, if we want our kids to have a good education, to have good prospects for the future, because Tim, I'm going to assume that probably we're of a similar age, that we're both born in the 80s, right? That like parents of that ilk were like, okay, well, I've been a tradesperson my whole life, or I've worked on a farm my whole life. Listen, you go to university, you qualify, you become a lawyer, a doctor, whatever, and life will be better for you, right? Which is, I mean, in a sense, in a material way, kind of yes, but you sort of sell your soul in the process, which is why I never did that journey myself. But, you know, these parents send these kids to boarding school, and what happens when they go to high schools in the city? They get indoctrinated, they get posed, they have all this urban nonsense.
They don't go home. They don't go home.
And in 90% of the cases, they don't go home. They stay in the city. They buy a property in the city. They sort of worsen. I mean, in the end, the worsening crisis the housing crisis is much more worsened by foreign immigration. But like, what's still happening is a demographic displacement from the rural areas to the city, where they don't need necessarily more people. These country towns don't have perpetuation. People, for the most part, don't go back. They don't bring their families back. They don't bring spouses back and populate those towns. They just slowly, over time, sort of bleed population to the cities, and then there's nothing to renew them, and that's a sad dynamic.
Furious, I don't disagree with you at all. But I remember in, I don't know, 2001, I think it was, when I hadn't long been in Australia, and me and my girl sold up on the Central Coast in New South Wales. And we went to Canberra because we wanted to meet some friends. From Canberra, we went to Victoria, and then we went right up through the outback to the capital of the Northern Territory, and then we went all the way along the top end and up Cape York, and ended up on Thursday Island, for God's sake. And the only thing I noticed on that whole trip was that in all these small Australian towns, you know, like Oodnadatta and you name it, all these towns, you might get a relatively cute Australian girl serving in the bar of a pub, but she was totally bored and didn't want to be there anymore. And obviously didn't have a bloke, you know. I don't know.
Yeah.
And this was in 2001. This was a long time ago. Man.
And it's only got worse, Iron Duke. I mean, you know, that there are places now you drive through them, and I remember reading there's a really interesting book. It talks about like the Italian POWs that came to Australia, and I actually recommend anyone should read it. It's called what's it called now? Rabbits and Spaghetti. If you can actually buy it, it's a really, really interesting book of the time, right? And you know, you think about these communities that these POWs were sent to, right? Because particularly a lot of Italians that were captured early in the war, like in Abyssinia or in that first year in North Africa under O'Connor and Auchinleck, you know, a lot of those POWs, they were first shipped to India and then sent to Australia, because obviously Australia had such a labor shortage because a lot of men volunteered and a lot of men were, you know, had to be sent to the armed forces, you know, to help Australia's war effort, both to fight, I suppose.
Do you want to know something curious about?
No, go ahead.
Hang on, go ahead. It's an interruption, and please forgive me.
Your channel, you can do whatever you want, mate.
No, my dad told me that in World War II, my dad was born in 1933, so he was a kid in World War II, all right? But he told me in Peckham Rye Park in South London, which is like a 200-acre park, there was an Italian prisoner of war camp. And the Italians were actually allowed to go out every day and work if they wanted to. And there were not a few English girls who took Italian prisoners of war as boyfriends. Honest story.
The Italians, you can't.
Story.
You
story,
can't trust them.
Story.
Yeah. Hide your daughters from the Italians. That's all I can give you the tip for.
But, you know, because we hated each other so very much.
Of course. Yeah. But the just on that point, like, you know, you look at some of these places where they worked, and you listen to how they were described as like bustling towns, and they had, you know, like a strong RSL club and a one or two really impressive pubs, and, you know, the cricket team was really successful, and the footy team, you know, even in like 1940, it had.
You're talking about real communities.
Exactly. You got to think, if a town was founded in like 1899 or 1895, whatever, it still would have had an honor board that was like 50, 60 years long, like at the bowls club or the cricket club, whatever, right? These places had their traditions, and they were vibrant, proud communities. But just over time, you know, what we've actually seen is not just this influx of people from overseas that have come to Australia, right? And to some degree, I mean, you know, you'd count yourself probably amongst this, Andrew. There's actually been a fair few English people who've gone, well, Britain's fucked, so we'll go to Australia, right? And so they've come here, but there's also
and never pretend anything else.
But obviously there's been a whole ton of third world immigration that's come here as well, like under the auspices of, you know, Howard and Turnbull and Rudd and Gillard, and they've all played their part in it, right? Certainly in just essentially the post Whitlam Fraser era, right? But also there's been this tragic dynamic of the agricultural areas have bled people to the cities, and actually someone shared a comment here. I want to touch back on it because it's so true, because I'm sort of like the antithesis of this. I go back home and like have beers with dad's friend, and it's like with my dad and his friends, and it's like, do you know who Thomas Carlyle is? And like, can I tell you something about Otto von Bismarck? And you know, like, I'll bring up these right-wing talking points. But someone said here, I don't know if it was Tomb of Arminius or Paleo Conservative Australian. Oh yeah, here we go, Tomb of Arminius. They as in the kids of country people, they come back and argue the professors' anti-white points with their families and break familial bonds. And I mean, I would extend that by saying that they chide and chastise their own families and friends with these left-wing talking points. And that is exactly it, is that not only have the rural populations been bleeding people to the cities, but back home, they bring the poison, this intellectual poison, into the community and imbue it into those communities, to the point where I even see now, even in country towns, you know, like advocacy for green policies. You know, like I see a little bit of traction for, shall I say, progressive values in certain country towns. I'm starting to even see LGBT flags in certain places in country towns, and it's just the case of once you start rotting out the core of something, right? As we all know, nature abhors a vacuum. And it is always the powerful force that fills it, and it is a slippery slope. And as someone who grew up in country Australia, and I really have a soft spot for it. You know, like I grew up many summers playing cricket in the Australian outback, you know, and working the fields. You know, like I was driving machinery at 10, 12 years old on the family farm, you know, harvesting. You know, so I know what it's about, you know, and droving thousands of sheep with, you know, with my family. It's basically a death spiral. And to say that on Australia Day is actually quite heartbreaking, but it's just, it's the fate of what's happened to these places. And it's sad because those places embody Australia. When people say, what's the heart and soul of Australia? It's that, you know, it is places, you know, like Ballarat and Bendigo and Townsville and Newcastle and Cairns and, you know, Wagga Wagga and Broken Hill. And, you know, I mean, even if I think of places in WA here, because there's not many of them, you know, like places like, you know, like Narrogin or Albany, you know,
look,
it's just,
you know what people get wrong? Furious is what people get wrong is like the original of Crocodile Dundee didn't live in the Northern Territory. He was an Australian rural farmer or a station guy. That's what he really was, you know. He learned to ride as a kid. He learned to shoot as a kid. He was this really good independent man, very much like the American cowboy. But he wasn't from the Northern Territory. Well, he might have been, but he would have been from a cattle station. Or if he'd have been from anywhere else in Australia, he would have been from a big farm or a big station somewhere.
It would have been like Mount Isa or the Kimberleys or somewhere in that hard country in the north. Exactly. Yeah, precisely. Yeah,
the exact guy that people like Banjo Patterson used to write about in the 1890s and the 1900s. That was the original of Crocodile Dundee. who has been kind of distorted in the 20th and 21st century. And in fact, in the 21st century, he just basically doesn't exist anymore at all.
Yeah. No,
I
no
mean,
joke.
The only like modern remaining sort of similar Crocodile Dundee figure you can think of, or somebody in real life, is Bob Catter. I mean, we'll probably never see a politician like him again. I mean, his electorate of Kennedy is centered on Mount Isa. I mean, he's a no-nonsense bushy, has no time for political correctness. He's very conservative in his values. Obviously, he's deeply concerned about the crocodiles in northern Queensland. Like, that's the only person that comes to mind in 21st century. Sort of, you think Crocodile Dundee or Catter.
Yeah, it's really hard to find. But actually, Tim, if you went back to like 1914, although Australia was still very urbanized and most Australians were from Sydney and Melbourne and Brisbane and what have you, back then Australia had far bigger numbers of like country Australians, bush Australians, who really could, like, they learned to ride when they were 6 or 7, they'd fire a gun when they were 7 or 8. That really used to be a big time true Australian thing, which is what Banjo Patterson writes about so much.
I mean, we have seen the decline of Australian agriculture. Well, it's not growing. Government policy has helped to cripple it with onerous environmental regulations, water policy, energy policy. We now obviously our manufacturing sector is also significantly declined, and I can't help but think that obviously the technology revolution, the internet, you and I are talking now, people move to the cities because like that's where the connectivity is. There's less agricultural activity going on, and more reliance on the globalized economy. That's why the regions have slowly died.
Yeah, absolutely. And just to touch on what Tim said, it's a good point that it is also a cascading effect whereby, say, for example, in my family sector, because my family just recently sort of transitioned from like large scope farming into a sort of a more, not quite a hobby farm, but like small acreage, right? Whereby if you had if communities went through a long drought period or through a tough economic situation where we had high inputs and low commodity prices for wool or sheep or wheat, barley, whatever grains, and what would sort of happen is that a lot of farmers who were and not to put too much onus on them, because I think a lot of this is exacerbated by the situation at large, which is beyond the average farmer's control, but notwithstanding, people ultimately to a point are responsible for their business decisions, and there are certain elements of the agricultural industry who are a little bit ill-disciplined. Say, for example, from a business sense, they spend a little bit more than they should. They resort too much on overdrafts. They have too many loans. They're a bit over-leveraged. All that sort of stuff, right? Is that when they're in a situation where they can no longer go on, right? They're compelled to sell and move on. And the thing is that they become price takers, not price makers. And the people who come in with money are usually sort of corporate entities, or, as sometimes does happen, more successful neighbors. Now, when I consider my father's district, right, when my father returned home to the farm from his schooling, right, which I'm talking like the 70s here, our district consisted of, I think there were upwards of between 65 and 70 families, right? That district, when I went to primary school, went down from, say, like 60, mid-60 something down to about 25. When I went back to the farm as an adult, like after I left high school, that went from 25 to 15. And now that same district, now that my own family have left, right, all of that land that was once shared by 60 odd, 70 odd families, 60 odd families, right, is now shared between 5. And that means there's literally 60 less families, 60 less groups of children, 60, or rather 30 less pairs of grandparents, right? The social cohesion of these places are destroyed because of the, you might say, the current model of agriculture, which means that in order to achieve business success or financial success, you have to go scale. And scale means you just have to buy out your neighbors. Scale means that if, as a family farm, you don't have enough capital for yourself, you have to bring in investors. And then when you bring in investors, you are beholden to your investors, right? Who themselves are beholden to other people.
So it's not really a family farm anymore.
Essentially, right? And then the other thing too is that affects the local community. So if you have, let's say your number of families halve, right? You've gone from a town with 100 and odd pupils in their school to 50. If there's 50 pupils rather than 100, you've halved the teaching staff, right? That's like, that's a few less people who go to the shop. And then, if there's less, grandparents in town, there's less cars.
So the shop's fucked too.
So rather than having 3 shops, you have 2. They employ less staff. And then, let's say with half the number of grandparents, there's 20 less cars in town. So the second mechanic can't run anymore. So he shuts down and his employees lose jobs. Like, these things become inherently cyclical, where eventually, once the population dries up, the services dry up, then the employment opportunities dry up. Yeah. All these things are cyclical, and it's just
once a thriving small town dies.
Yeah, exactly, and it just happens by drips. And if you can imagine, like a big 10,000 liter water tank, you think it'll never end, but drip, 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 and then eventually the tank empties. That's exactly what happens.
Totally see where you're coming from. I really do.
And also from a cultural standpoint, I mentioned like the whole boys aspect, and I mean this happens to boys and girls, but more so girls, because I just think they're more impressionable. Sorry, no disrespect, Lady Charlotte, but like they're sold like, oh, you go to the city and there's cafes and restaurants and university and social clubs, and you can if you get like you get a degree, you can become a doctor and a lawyer and live the high life and buy a Mercedes or a BMW. Like, oh, mum and dad are stuck with their Ford or their Falcon or their Commodore, or the cheap Toyota Camry, and grandpa still drives his busted old Kingswood or whatever, and I've got a flash new car, and like they're sold the package. And that's the problem, is that advocates of rural Australia, and I mean, I don't even say this with animosity, because I don't blame these people necessarily, because, even people like us in our circles have only learned stuff recently about, like, say, for example, analysis of people such as like, Carlyle or the Juvenile or whatever, giving us insight into our own belief systems and what they should be. But, like, they have not sold the virtues of rural Australia. And so they've just had to basically beg government for money to uphold infrastructure that is still withering away. And they don't actually, like, the thing with the left is this, and I say this to all of like people, a lot of people around me, right? IRL, is that the left sell toxic ideas, but why the left succeeds is because they sell ideas. People are motivated by vision, and the right wing, by and large, have not sold ideas to people.
One of the things that strikes me is the rural Australia, like whether you be on a big farm or you be on a cattle station or whatever it is. A lot of that for a young bloke is actually pretty damn cool,
Well, I've realized that now in my 30s.
Whether it be riding horses, using sheepdogs, maybe even sometimes learning to fly a helicopter and this kind of stuff, which I know is quite common.
Motorbikes or whatever,
or road bikes and all this kind of stuff. All of that for a young bloke, it's kind of cool. And also, of course, you're out there in the middle of the bush, and it's a bit of an adventure. There are dangerous snakes and all this kind of stuff. And it's a bit of an adventure. So for a young bloke, absolutely, I can see, why wouldn't you want to do that? Because in many respects, as I'm sure you know yourself from personal experience, it's a good life for a young man.
This is the thing, right? Sorry, I'll hand it over because I just want to make this point, is that this is why a journey of self-discovery is important. This is why knowledge is important. Even though, like, I was a relatively well-educated, teenager / young adult. See, I used to like almost become a bit dependent on drinking to like cope with the isolation. But now that I've reorientated myself and I sort of have a better understanding of me and what it is, or conceptually what a good life ought to be for someone like myself, right? And what things I should orientate myself towards, is that, like my family, the property, legacy, and applying myself to activities that are wholesome and good. It's a case of actually now, because I've been sort of sober for the better part of 10 years now, is that actually the isolation isn't something I struggle to cope with. I savor the isolation. I love not being stuck in peak hour traffic. I love not being yelled at by drunkards. I love not, confronting the things about a city that are unpleasant. And also from a business sense, like I love working with my old man. I love being, to whatever degree I am, master of my own destiny, my own realm, and looking over what is ours and governing it, and actually having a part in this idea of a handover between one generation to another. Like, I appreciate those things. It's like, I wish I could have a conversation with my 20-year-old self and shake it out of me. But you know what? We all have to learn things, especially us men. We sometimes learn shit the hard way. So, but I'll pass on the torch.
100%, mate.
I've been ranting about country Australia for 20 minutes now, so I'll pass on the torch.
I just think it's a bit harder of a sell to girls. Like, the girl I know best at the moment is an American chick who got very badly injured when she got a horse chucked her off into a brick wall, which is never a good thing. But she's the girl I know best. But she's pretty traditional American girl, like cowboys, all this kind of stuff. But it's harder to sell that to women than it is to blokes. It just is, because blokes like isolation, adventure, discovering places. Like on a big outback station in Australia, it is perfectly possible to go to a place on that station that you might be the first white guy who's ever been there, just because it's so huge.
Or first person, full stop.
First person, full stop. You might be the first person to ever go there. And for blokes, that stuff is exciting. It is.
Absolutely.
It's cool. It's like our Captain Cook moment,
And for a stream that's been full of black pills, I actually want to offer this white pill on the subject. Sorry, and then I will just go off for a bit. That it's interesting that I've watched a fair bit of stuff recently in our circles, and I think the guys at Lotus Eaters even covered this a little bit, because I know sort of Connor's sort of touches on this subject, and it's true, and it's why like people like us shouldn't malign. Like when those women go on TikTok and they sort of cry and shriek about being lied to and how like the world's fucked up and they have like no me time and they're in the hamster wheel, they get no break. I actually think that people now are getting totally burnt out by modernity. Not everyone. I think it's still very much a minority of people, but it is a white pill to recognize that there are people who actually can't cope with the system as it is. They cannot cope, being rammed in that wet hamster wheel 24/7, going through the motions, but acting on hyperdrive, dopamine burnout,
I'm one.
just being, well, exactly. You've gone countries, Lady Charlotte. Is that, but what's heartening is that seeing young women, like women in their 20s and 30s, realizing this was a lie. The feminists sold me a lie. University sold me a lie. I can't handle this. It's wrong. And it's like, yes, you as a human being, as a product of, centuries and millennia of, adaptive evolutionary biology, aren't built for this. They have lied to you. We on the right are telling you the truth. Because what we are talking about is consistent with not just nature, but how we as creatures, as beings interact with nature. We are correct. And we have to sell that idea to them, essentially. But I'm going to go on mute now because I've not been ranting, so I'll leave it to you guys for a bit.
No, cute, cool, man. I totally agree. Wilm, what do you think, mate?
I mean, obviously, modernity, we're talking about, there's two different types of modernity. There's the technological advancement, and then there's the what some call the cultural advancement. There is some debate whether you could separate those two. Certainly, with social media platforms such as TikTok has certainly helped to degenerate our culture, but since that is owned by communist China, there's a lot of debate whether this is just used as a platform to corrupt the West, and so I'm not sure what the rest of your thoughts are about whether there's this interconnection between the advancement of technological modernity and the culture. Other nations have shown that it doesn't need to, that this correlation isn't necessarily causation. I mean, nationalists from around the world have been able to connect, but then it's been easier for authorities to arrest and jail nationalists as well. I
would say, Wilms, I would say that what I have noticed is that within Russia and Siberia and all the various distant places from Moscow and St. Petersburg in Russia, it seems to be fairly common for blokes and women to get together and get married and, like, you know, start some sort of farm or something pretty healthy, to be honest. In Russia, that seems to be still possible. In the West, it seems to be less and less possible.
But Russia's birth rate tells a different story from that.
Oh yeah, I know their birth rate's not very good, mate, but it's better than ours, which is not difficult, to be honest. Not difficult, to be honest. Lady Charlotte, what do you think?
What do I think about why the modern world stinks?
The stuff we've been talking about, starting a farm.
Yeah.
Like you as a woman meeting a bloke who wanted to start a farm or a station or something. What do you think about that stuff?
Yeah, well, you need money to do that. You know, to read. I think if you talk to quite a few people in Melbourne right now, they would tell you that they would love to get the hell out of it, but they can't because they don't have the financial means. And the problem with being out in places like Gippsland is how you're going to earn a living. Now, COVID has made it so that you can work online and you can work from home. So in a strange way, it has benefited us in that respect, that you can work online. But there's still that awful pull of the city, and cities are important. I mean, they are important for innovation, important for networking and connection. It's really difficult. The people I talk to down here, the country people, they have generally had to maybe leave the country for a while to appreciate it and then come back. I think it's what Furious referred to earlier on, that sometimes you need to go away from a place to see what it's really worth and then come back. Yeah, it's lovely out here, but you've got to think about how you're going to make a living if you need to. And if you've got children, what about them? It's not just about you. Do your children need friends and a network of support? So you've got to, I mean, I'm still working my way through that. And what I may like, because I don't particularly need restaurants, coffee shops, those kind of things, but that's me. Other people may well need that. So it's something that you've got to think about. Grass isn't always fairly greener.
So, sure, I always like the Franklin talking about the coffee shop in Melbourne, where everyone was sitting on a milk crate having their ass frozen off in a Melbourne winter.
That sounds like.
Yeah, that to me is a Melbourne coffee shop. You know, it's like, I don't care about coffee shops. I really don't. You know, I like coffee, but I don't want to go to a coffee shop.
No, me neither. But I'm not a teenager. Hate to break it to everyone. I'm not. So you know, young. The things that
I'm much older
are okay when you're 8. The things you need when you're 18,
yeah.
you may not need when you're 38. So you need to think about those things. And if you move a family to the country, you have to think about what they need as well, because they're at a different stage in life to what you are.
The only thing I would say, Lady Charlotte, is if you move a family into the country, especially providing you have a dog, and I know you do, you have a nice Labrador dog. If you move a family to the country, and especially if you have a nice dog, because like children and dogs are absolutely natural friends. And a good dog will often defend a child, by the way. Very, very often. I did look every single time. I was born in the middle of London, Lady Rock, and all I ever wanted was to live in the countryside. It's the only thing I ever wanted as a child. Apart from having a good dog, although I did sometimes have a good dog in the city, but you know. But yeah, if you're a white European Western family, move to the countryside, get your kids a dog, and your kids will be forever grateful, because there are no end to the adventures you can have in the countryside as a child, especially if you have a good doggo friend. There's just no end.
Almost definitely, it's wonderful. And you know, I lived most of my life in cities. I grew up in a very small house in a not very nice part of a city which had bombs going off. So all I ever wanted was
in the middle of a semi-war. I know, but
a minor geopolitical war. Yeah. So, but there's always a trade-off with everything, and there's things that you have to accept that you're gonna maybe have to give up, or you're not going to get, or in my case, the post doesn't get delivered, so you have to go to the local post office and pick your mail up, you know, those kind of things. But it's getting that balance, and it's figuring out how you're gonna,
that's kind of cool,
work, how you're gonna feed yourself, how you're gonna pay your bills.
Lady, sure, that's kind of cool though, you know, having to go to as an expedition to the post office to collect the mail, take the dog with you. Sounds kind of cool to me. As a kid, that would be cool to me, you know.
I do love I just missed the comment here, but someone said about nonsense. You know, oh, here we go. Yeah, but Bodvar lies. I know you people watching while sipping your macchiato in Fitzroy. Oh, I mean, what's actually funny, if I could actually tell a small joke about Fitzroy,
you're so wrong about me, boys. But yeah,
is that I actually I went to
I know Fitzroy, but
no, Fitzroy's freaking horrendous. But I actually went to Sorry, go Tim.
Yeah, Melbourne's in the north. Whenever I go, like, encounter it these days, like, I get a shudder. It's as bad as most other people who have heard of it in Australia think. It's like basically like a inner city socialist hellhole.
Oh yeah, it really is. I used to live in Melbourne for a time, and I have family who live in Melbourne, and my aunt really wanted to take me to a place that was not far from there. They sort of did, like, you know, brunch and coffee and whatever. And I remember just walking down. I can't remember what the main sort of strip in Fitzroy is, the main sort of drag, but I remember she'd park the car in a car park and walk into this cafe, and just I mean, I've often done this elsewhere, but just in all places Fitzroy specific, I was kind of like just trying to hide my sense of derision by everything that I saw. Yeah, so I know what you mean, Tim. It's actually quite the scene.
Yeah, I don't know. Melbourne has some lovely 19th century buildings. It really does.
It does.
Yeah,
There's still
it's
lovely
a
parts
very
of Melbourne.
pretty.
Oh yeah, there's beautiful architecture. I know that quite a bit of it, unfortunately, was knocked down in the 50s and 60s for redevelopment. Before they managed to get protection orders on buildings. But there's some stunning architecture, and it is a, it's got so much. It is a beautiful city in many ways, but unfortunately, the people who live
Gardens, Melbourne Zoo, great places. They really are. But look at these. There are workmen's cottages in Melbourne that were literally built as workmen's cottages in the somewhere between the mid 1870s and the 1890s. You will now pay over $1 million for it. They will cost you over $1 million, and they were built as a workman's cottage.
Yeah, exactly. And it just happens to be this accent of proximity and market speculation that has made these places essentially the playthings of investors and speculators. And I mean, I'm not one to denigrate people who are genuinely successful in life. But there is always that money class who sort of always sees the paupers as lesser people and like to, speculate, and the consequence of that speculation be damned. And if it harms the little guy in society, well, stiff biscuits. I still have my mansion in whatever rich suburb I live in, and I can still drive my, my Rolls Royce or my Ferrari, and suck it, little guy. And that's the thing. And
fuck the nation you come from. Yeah, exactly.
And this touches on a point that Bowden makes. I think Bowden's so true because in his speeches he'd talk about like bringing the traditional good element of the left and the right into like the one thing. And he'd say that the Tories believe in patriotism, but only for a certain class of citizen. And it's actually quite true that he says that, because then there's like the working class who sort of believe in the idea of traditional British values, but only with a certain economic model. He's like, if you can unsheath that left from the other right, you sort of meet in the middle, and sort of create like the perfect political entity. And I think that's actually, that is the sense that some of these people of that speculative market merchant class have, is this mindset that, well, I'm in this sort of cadre of people in this caste, and the lesser people be damned. And this is where like the Liberal Party itself doesn't make sense, is that is that you've got essentially city urbanites who are cultural moderates, and then you have, like for instance, a lot of country districts vote for Liberal Party around Australia. There's Queensland voting for the LNP, rural Victoria, rural New South Wales, South Australia, and WA, and they'll vote for the same party, but essentially the leftist moderate type, the economically sort of liberal cultural moderate types hate agriculturalists. They don't like rural people. It's like, why do you two share the same party? Or rather, I say to the farmers, why do you exist in the same party with these people? They don't like you. They profit off the labor.
Furious. If there are no farmers, we all starve. But anyway.
Yeah.
Because I just see the people who stop us starving. They just are.
Yeah, Pete Gossyman's right. The Nationals need to walk away from the Liberals. It's exactly right, because I've sat in.
I actually agree with that. Yeah, 100% agree with that. The Nationals need to say, no, I'm sorry, the Liberals are not us anymore. I totally agree with that.
And I think as a class of people, Australian agricultural, just regional people who live in the country, needs to just go, actually, you know what? The Liberal Party doesn't serve our purposes. And in fact, the Liberal Party are just as culpable as the Labor Party of having sapped the regions dry. They have taxed us, and they have just left us to wither on the vine, and we shouldn't give them our vote. And it makes me aghast when I consider even nowadays, like the amount of people say, like my dad's age, like the boomers, right, is they'll still go like these Liberal Party functions. They'll still go to these AGMs and these meetings. It's like, why? The people who run this party detest you as a class of people. They detest your identity, and you can't bring them to reason. They just will not see it. And for them, it's like, oh well, I voted Liberal my whole life. My dad was a Liberal Party voter, and my dad loved Menzies. And it's like, well, things change, mate. Like honestly, things change.
Earlier, as you said earlier, the Nationals need to walk away from the Liberals. It sounds
100%.
This is not us anymore.
Yep. Totally
true. Totally.
What do you reckon about that, Tim? Because I know you sort of tend to do a lot of political coverage. Do you have an opinion on that?
Tim?
Well, he's here, sort of, but
I don't know. Maybe
that's all right.
Maybe.
Well, whilst we wait for Tim, Lady Charlotte, I know you've sort of, when I say recently, like in the last sort of few months or so, you've moved out of Melbourne to the countryside. Do you sort of see this attitude that I'm talking about, like amongst country people who are still rusted onto the party that they voted for? It's hard to bring them around.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, it's bizarre, isn't it, that people they vote that way because their parents voted that way, or because I've always voted that way, or it's terrible. It's terrible. I wonder if it'll change with the younger people, but it does seem to be like they're sort of trapped in a it's terrible. It's terrible. I wonder. Sorry, I'm hearing myself now. I think my can you hear? Yeah, I think my device is getting affected.
No, it was Tim with his open mic. You're fine.
Okay.
Continue.
There's fireworks down here too in the background, so it's getting a bit noisy.
Actually, we can't hear it for what it's worth.
Oh, that's good. That's good. I've tried to sort of soundproof things as much as possible. Yeah, usually you can't hear a thing here, but today, of course, being Australia Day, there's a bit more going on.
Actually, can I just grab a
small guys, I must ask you this. Speaking as a pommy bastard who's lived in Australia for 23 years now, Australia Day to me seems such a mess at the moment, and it's not from the real true blue Aussies who I think still fly Australian flags. It's from the mainstream media and all the bullshit that we all face these days.
It is.
That's
it is.
What
it's
it
all
looks like to me.
It's top down completely. Yeah, the ordinary Australians don't have it. This is all top down. Small group of activists who have pushed an agenda, and they've got into sport, they've got into everything, even sports politicised now. You had the Australian cricket team, the captain Pat Cummins, who must be one of the wokest libtards you've ever walked the face of the earth, didn't want to mention Australia Day at the Australia Day test today in Brisbane.
Yeah, see, if I was the director of Cricket Australia, I would confiscate his baggy green and drop him from the team. See, that's what
disgusting.
That's what a self-confident nation would do. By the way, can I just give a recommendation to Tim if he's there, mate? If you're on if you got a tablet, if you happen to be at home, throw it in the freezer for 10 minutes and come back on, because that actually works. But no more than 10 minutes. But that will cool your device down. Anyway, sorry, continue. Sorry. I want to share an anecdote because Lady Charlotte mentioned fireworks. You know, it's funny. It's because it's a bit of a family anecdote. Is that my grandfather didn't actually hate fireworks insofar that he just wasn't a fan of them. And you know what the interesting thing is? You'd appreciate this reference, Iron Duke, is that because he was he was actually originally a military policeman. He was like drafted into the infantry in North Africa, right? But the noise that he heard when like the Germans would use it, because the Germans had a couple of divisions in North Africa, hence the Africa Corps, right? Yeah. The noise that the Allied tanks made when they were hit by an 88 shell was a similar noise to like when big fireworks crack. And so my grandfather, because he was in the infantry, sort of hated the noise of like fireworks. It reminded him of watching, because I mean, you'd probably know in the early part of the campaign, like when Rommel first got there, he used those 88s, a devastating effect against British armor. And yeah, just like my grandfather always associated the noise of like big fireworks with flak. Interesting little pointer.
I'll be honest with you, mate. My thing with fireworks is more because I'm an enormous dog lover, and dogs don't like fireworks.
Dogs hate fireworks.
Thunder.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. They don't like fireworks or thunder.
I don't particularly like them either, but that's because when I was growing up in Belfast, if you heard those noises, it didn't mean that a car had backfired. It meant that something bad was happening.
Yeah,
we actually couldn't buy fireworks at the shop or anything. That they would have council shows that the local authorities would put on an official firework display, but you couldn't buy them for that very reason.
I used to buy them for my son when he was little, for like November 5th, Guy Fawkes Day and all this kind of stuff in England. But I always made sure our dogs were right in the middle of the house, and dogs don't like that sort of thing at all. Dogs mostly don't like thunder, as I'm sure you know. Furious and maybe
that's right.
And yeah, so for that reason, I'm not huge fans of them, because I think that like human civilization would never have got where it is now, but for dogs and horses. It was dogs and horses that allow Western civilization to become as wonderful as it was before. Like sometime around 1940, we decided to destroy it, and probably a bit before that as well, in all truth. But anyway, it's just me.
Yeah, and another point from Tim, because he's obviously in the comments still. Fireworks ban is just more of the Australian nanny-state, and I mean, I know we've all talked about this. Because I think you and I might have been on UO actually when AA talked about it. When we talked about like the lockdown situation here. I think it was actually the first time we sort of met each other, so to speak.
Yes, that's right.
Growing up here, I always conceived of Australians as being a laid-back people, and she'll be right, and no fuss, mate, and whatever, don't worry about it next week. No, that was the attitude I grew up around in like the country towns that I lived in, right? But my God, and even though sort of things have been getting progressively worse in the last sort of 20 or so years, I never for once, if you had told me in 2018 that 2021 was going to happen like it did, I would not have believed you. But my God, did I get an insight into the Australian psyche. And when I say that, I'm not saying that to denigrate average Australians. I mean our elites, like our bureaucracy and the apparatchiks who occupy government. When I look back, I'm still astonished by it.
Yeah, I know. The Victorian police were inundated with informers. People just couldn't wait to get on the phone and inform the police that their next door neighbour had gone out twice in one day instead of just once. And it's incredible.
When I moved here, Lady of Charlotte, right, and I'd lived in South Africa for 15 years before I moved here. But when I moved here, my Australian girl, love of my life, by the way, turned around and said to me, no, Tep, you'll find Australians are way more laid back and nowhere near so pro-government as Brits and all the rest of it. Yeah, that did not prove to be true during the China virus at all. Not at all. I mean, don't get me wrong, the Brits were fucking awful, but the Australians were no better. No better at all.
No, it was terrible.
Well, I'd say it's worse so far that Australians do see themselves as laid-back people, and the fact that we betrayed that idea probably makes us worse. Because at the very least, I think the British do see themselves as like an organised and orderly people, more so than Aussies.
Oh, where on earth was Ned Kelly during COVID, Furious? I never spotted him myself.
Nope.
I didn't see him.
No, that's right. But what is sort of intriguing though is that I kind of feel that at the same time, as much as that was bad, the people who resisted the mandates and you know, the treatment and all that sort of stuff down here. These are people who will withstand almost anything. If they made it through in Australia, you can almost make it through anything.
Yeah, absolutely.
I never even got one single test.
Yeah.
Curious.
Well,
not one.
Me neither.
Never got
good on yous. Good.
Yeah.
That's very, you know, for our viewers, let's say that's a very encouraging thing, you know.
I never got a test, and I wore a mask, I don't know, for about 2 or 3 weeks, and I thought, fuck this. And I just stopped. And I would occasionally walk into like a Woolies or a Coles supermarket, and someone on the gate would say, "You haven't got a mask on," and I would just say, "Fuck off," and walk in. But that to me was Australian, you know.
I was going to say, if you have one of your old, or if you did have any of your old uniforms, Andrew, you should have like strolled into your local Coles with your colours and.
Yeah. Well, then I would have been called a pommy bastard, no doubt. But anyway, whatever. But yeah, okay. Look, guys, Wilms. I want to point out that Wilms from has a very good channel on YouTube where he streams every week.
He does.
And he's also related to another bigger channel. What's that called, Lady Schlock?
Well, he's got the Wilms Front channel. That's the Unshackled, and then he also has
Unshackled. Thank you very much.
The Unshackled is his main channel, but he also has a fantastic little show called The Theorists, which I particularly like because I do love a good conspiracy theory.
Excellent.
And he runs that every so often with a great character called Andy Nolsh. But that's not. I don't think they're running that show again until I think maybe February. I think Andy's away. But The Unshackled is an absolutely fantastic. What I love about it is that Tim reads and watches all this awful normie TV and normie news, so I don't have to. So all I need to do is watch The Unshackled week.
True.
Tim, there's a dedicated band of us viewers, and we watch every week because Tim does it, so we don't have to. And that's Tim Wills.
Tim Wills is the Dave Distributist of Down Under. He watches the intolerable lefty shit, so we don't have to do it. He does. He
watches these characters, and he and he goes along to events, and it's great because. God, I can't stand. I mean, I encountered some normie TV the other day. I took my youngest son to the hairdressers for a haircut. Good grief! I don't know how people watch this stuff. They have the TV on, and it was just. I couldn't stick it. I was in there for about 20 minutes, and I had to go and stand outside. It was awful, and I thought people watch this all day, every day. How do they do it?
That's the brain rot, though. It's not a case of how they do it. It's actually what made them that way.
Yeah,
it's actually interesting.
Dreadful.
When I said I was going to pass the mic over, I actually needed to top up my coffee, so I went to the kitchen and got coffee, and it's amazing. In the minute and a half it took me to make coffee, right? Because the Australian Open's on, obviously the tennis, and both my folks, but especially my mum, just loves tennis. She's always played and watched it.
Yeah.
And in the ad break, they managed to have an advert for what is it? Married at First Sight, and because it's the new trendy thing, they had to have like 2 lesbians snogging in the ad break, you know, in what is essentially, because you got to think, it's now evening time, but you know what was the afternoon television coverage when children would be watching. The idea of, you know, like indecency totally out the window, and this is the thing. This is the slow creep of indoctrination. It's just like drip, 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 drip.
Yeah, man.
And it's not that they don't care. They do it because they know it works, and it's just wow, you know. I just like, wow, I'm just going to go back and stream my friends because this is disgusting.
It's true. I mean, every advert's got a black man with a white woman. I've yet to see a couple like that in real life, but there you go, obviously.
Yeah, you hardly ever do. Ever do. But according to British, Australian, American TV, it's the norm, which it is not. But why are they trying to tell us it is? Because they love us, or because they want to destroy us? Me, I think it's because they want to destroy us. But anyway, I will say, Worms From has a great channel. He has a weekly video stream which looks at the world from an Australian point of view, and I will, once the stream finishes, well, actually not immediately, but within a couple of hours, I will put Tim's channel in the description so you can go link it. Lady,
and we should credit him. Sorry, just to say, we should credit him because Tim's been at it a long time. I still sort of remember, like in Normiville, like even pre-2016, right? You know, like in the lead up to the Trump election, I still remember his stuff used to be shared like even on Facebook.
Tim's a good guy for sure. 100%.
Yeah, but he's been at it a long time, and people in our sphere should be very grateful for the work that Tim's done because he's been at it for many years now.
Yep.
And it's been people like him who have helped us to, like, shall I say, prise open a gap, and where people like us have found each other. And my gratitude.
Right.
I mean, today's the first time I ever talked to Tim, but as for myself, I'm sure I speak for all three of us here. Thank you, Tim, and pleasure as always, mate. And hopefully we get another chance to chat again. But thank you for all the good work you've done in our circles, my friends.
Definitely, I remember Tim, but I was still living in the UK, and because I used to follow this character called Anxious Aussie, and she doesn't. I don't think she streams anymore, but I used to follow the things that she used to put on YouTube. But this is back in the old days when you could still put things on YouTube and not get them kicked off. So I sort of find Tim via her, and I was still living in Yorkshire in England. So there you go. It's fantastic. And I don't know what we'd do without Tim, because I would have to watch these awful programs myself if he didn't do it for me.
Almost
God
always.
bless you, Tim.
Sure. When I watch Tim's weekly roundup of news and events, I almost always see you on the chat. So yeah.
Oh, I love Tim. I mean, Tim and I met in. We went to the infamous Posey Parker Let Women Speak event where the Roman salutes were thrown and lots of objects were thrown, and that event actually resulted in of course the Roman salute being banned in Victoria. Yeah.
Don't ever try and stop a bus.
I hate being severed from my tradition.
Never try and stop a bus, honestly.
Yeah. Don't be careful how you hail a taxi in Melbourne. Yeah.
Have you seen that? Have you seen that meme, guys? Where it's like, it's got like the angles of the arm, and it's like when it's straight up, you're hailing a taxi or a bus, and then like down below, you're waving to a friend, and then there's like 30 degrees in the middle. It's like 5 years imprisonment.
Right.
I don't want to go to jail for 5 years.
Lunacy.
Dictator Dan.
Like, I just wanted a taxi. No. Oh well. If we didn't laugh, we'd cry, guys. If we didn't laugh, we'd cry.
Yeah,
it's true. What a place! What a place Melbourne is! What a place! Goodness.
Oh, well, I mean, chop down Captain Kirk, go and desecrate some Queen Victoria thing, and okay, boys, that's gonna help you win, isn't it? But
Iron Duke, I don't know if you saw
anything you wanted to.
Oh yes, okay. Yes, I recently did a stream about. I was with a gentleman by the name of Connor McHugh, I think his name is, and he's like an American sort of papist Catholic sort of type, like the trad Cath, and he's a very, very nice guy actually, very, very good chap. And we spoke about, we're sort of like comparing like legacies of kingship between various civilizational spheres. So we talked about like the Greeks, the Romans, the Persians, the Egyptians, and how those older ideas of kinship sort of percolated into the modern understanding of of emperors and kings, and like the ideas of like regality and forms of monarchy, and and how in the modern day where those older and newer types are similar and where they're different. It was actually a really interesting discussion. I was a little bit ill prepared for it because I just come off working at Harvest, I'd ordered some books that hadn't arrived, so I kind of went in a little bit bare bones, but it was still a very interesting chat. And end of the weekend or early next week, I'll be streaming with Hitman. We're going to cover part 2 of my Reminiscences of Africa, which is the book by Paul Emil von Lettow-Vorbeck. It talks about the German East Africa campaign of World War I. And then that's about it for me. I think for a while. Apostolic Majesty and I have to talk about our scheduling for this year, because we did take a bit of a break last year because we were both sort of suffering a bit of burnout. But hopefully this year we'll get back, because we got a few ideas that we might canvas. And Duke, because I still got to wait for my text, because I'm basically the conversation you and I want to have about Caesar is a conversation I have to have with Auron as well, McIntyre. During my convalescence, I will hopefully get some reading done, and then we'll have to I have to stream with Auron about Caesar, and then you and I can talk about it too.
You, mate, is I would like to compare Rubicon by the author. I'm sure you all know these books because you're
Tom Holland. Yeah, I've actually.
I don't like Tom Holland very much. I'm not a big fan. Whereas if you look at Caesar, what's it called? The Story of a Colossus by Adrian Goldsworthy.
Yeah, Adrian Goldsworthy is a much better author in my opinion.
Yeah, much better author, much better historian. And incidentally, Adrian Goldsworthy has recently started a pretty big YouTube channel. If you haven't seen it,
I didn't know that. I hate Tom Holland. Sorry, he's just awful.
Yeah, I don't like Tom Holland. I don't like anyone who doesn't like Caesar, basically.
I will say that Tom Holland is a good author, and he writes in a very compelling way, and I have liked his books. You know, Persian Fire, Rubicon, Millennium have been good books, but he's a man who can't keep his politics out of his writing. So
he's a lefty. He's a lefty.
Well, he recently posted a picture of himself with Julia Gillard, so that was just the end. I mean, God help us.
But this is a recommendation, actually, well, either for both of you, but just for our listeners by and large. If you actually like, if you're the sort of person who, like me, a bit later in life, had quite an interest for like late Empire and into the Eastern Empire, like into Byzantium. One of the best authors of that period in terms of Anglospheric authors, because, you know, there's a lot of, for example, if you want a Greek author, Anthony Kalidas is very good. But the two authors I've really enjoyed, one, Judith Heron, she really was responsible for my flourishing of my knowledge on Byzantium. And another one who's very much from the Anglo-English sphere, John Julius Norwich, who I highly, highly recommend.
Yeah.
He's a very, very good author. And if you haven't come across him, his book on Sicily and his book on the East Roman Empire are both fantastic.
Cool.
Great recommendation.
But being an Australian, Australia Day thing, should we give some? How about the three of us? Do we have any recommendations for Australian books? I think we should end on that note. That might be better.
I definitely have one, but we're not going to end just yet.
Okay, cool.
Tomb of Arminius. Any news on the Australian event?
Yeah, that's a really good question.
On that to you is it is being worked on.
We're cooking, so to speak.
That's the end of that story. Yeah.
Mary Beard belongs
Michael
with
K90 Century fan. Yeah, Mary Beard is a left-wing feminist.
She
very
is
ugly woman.
A shrill.
Just ignore her, basically.
Yes. It's funny that she had the debate about Rome and Greece with Boris Johnson because they deserve each other.
And she lost, and quite rightly she lost.
Yeah.
But
yes. Yeah. And if for example, paradise is a place where justice comes to pass, those two would like be in union together because they're both disgusting and deserve each other. So
yeah, probably true.
Oh, she's horrible. I remember years ago she was on Question Time. And a member of the audience asked a question about immigration, and of course she said, "Well, you know, the Romans they had immigrant." And you think, no,
they were diverse.
That's really not. That's not the same. That's not the same. Awful.
Yeah, because like a multinational empire is the same thing as 2020 New York or London. It's totally the same thing.
Just the same.
Furious. Where have you heard that about the British Empire? Where have you heard that, though? It was the diverse empire. But somehow or other, it was multicultural. No, it wasn't.
Yeah.
Yeah,
exactly.
It just wasn't.
No.
Like the British Empire, like the Roman Empire, would let people who they conquered keep their own gods.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah?
Mm-hmm.
They were.
Yeah, exactly.
Absolutely. If you were a Hindu or a Mohammedan or whatever in the British Empire, you could keep those gods. If you were a Roman soldier and you conquered some place, the locals could keep those gods. So long as they weren't doing human sacrifices or something like that, the Romans would say, yeah, all right, no, don't care, really.
Precisely.
You know? It's not what these modern multiculturalists try and pretend it was. Not at all.
Yeah, no, precisely right. And it's the idea of that you actually have a nation that has sort of self-sovereignty and esteem that expands itself as a result of its prowess. And but at the same time, both Britain and Rome had a very similar attitude to this idea of having a mission to civilize and of being bearers of themselves a great civilization. That is not the same as being demographically displaced in your own capital city, being lorded over by elites that hate its own country and people. Those things are not remotely the same.
100%.
Very distinct circumstances. And I think people like people like us, ought to keep that, in mind, because leftists will always play that card every time, and they always misrepresent it. It's amazing that Mary Beard larps as a historian when she's basically an academic activist. Who, I mean, I'm not saying she's not knowledgeable about history; she is, but she uses it for the wrong reasons.
Lesbian lefty,
a shrill lesbian academic crone, right? And in the end, if you want a modern historian who's actually good, right? One of the people I absolutely adore, and I've loved his work ever since I became interested in history, even as a child, is Andrew Wallace Hadrill, who used to be the dean of the British School in Rome, and who is one of the leading archaeologists that preserves the ruins of Herculaneum and Pompeii. And I can listen to that man talk all day. He's absolutely remarkable. And you know what? He doesn't get a tenth of the coverage of Mary Beard. And you know what? He's 10 times the scholar.
My goal was watching videos about Herculaneum just today. And I've been to Herculaneum and to Pompeii, fabulous places to visit.
Absolutely.
And absolutely, I mean, all right, the Greeks definitely were the original starters of Western civilization. But it was the Romans who carried it on and expanded it 100%.
You know what's funny? I once heard a quote, and I'm trying to think of its framing of it. Someone said that English history is more. I'm trying to think. English history is more. I think it's a long time ago I came across this. I think this is the correct framing, that English history is more influenced by the events of the Battle of Marathon than by the Battle of Hastings. Essentially, if the Greeks had lost and there had been no nascent Greek civilization, right, the modern conception of a Western Europe and a what we'd understand to be a medieval England and then a British Empire simply would not have come into being. Certainly not in the way that we understand it today, that has layers of Greco-Roman influence, layers of Norman influence and Anglo-Saxon influence, and forming this sort of Brythonic or British culture that we understand today.
I tell you what, Purist,
hang on, Andrew, just give me a second. I would actually posit that argument is true for Australia. In terms of the modern nation of Australia, as we understand today, as an offshoot of Britain, as a part of the Commonwealth, the Battle of Marathon has a greater bearing on Australian history than Botany Bay. If the British or the French or the Prussians or whoever, the Spanish had planted their flag on Botany Bay, essentially Australia would have been a European outpost of some kind. But had Marathon not gone the way that it did, the whole concept of the West may have been questionable. So it's interesting that analogy might ring true. Not everyone might agree with it, but it's just food for thought for our listeners.
Yeah, no, some truth.
So sorry, you are going to ask me, Iron Duke. What were we going to ask?
Sort of bias in British history there was. The thing I wanted to ask you about, Furious, is because I know you're mates with the excellent Apostolic Majesty.
Indeed.
A
The peerless
stream I
apostolic
would
monarchy.
really like to do, which I suspect you would find very interesting, is what if, right, this is a what if stream, and I know Apostolic Majesty does some what if streams. What if Britain and Italy did not get in a row over Mussolini and Abyssinia in the 1930s? Because to me, like, the British colonists in Kenya were not at all against the Italian colonists in Abyssinia. They weren't. Was Mussolini a worse bloke than the Emperor of Abyssinia? No, not at all. And I would just think it would be an interesting what if, particularly because Italy originally had gone quite angry about the Germans with the Angschluss, joining Austria into Germany. They didn't like that very much for pretty obvious reasons. And I'm just saying, if you didn't have idiot British politicians who wanted to somehow cause an argument with Italy, which was actually mostly traditionally pro-British, I think you could say. If we didn't do that over Abyssinia, how might that have changed world history? Because it actually might have quite a lot, I think.
I mean, it's an interesting what if, and I agree that. I mean, I could always run it past Apostolic. Depends what he has in mind in terms of the schedule.
That's why
can I just intercede here? Sorry, I'm going to have to go. Sorry, but guys, I'm going to have to leave.
No, that's okay.
Before you do, Lady Scott, please share your channel. But I will put a link in the description.
Oh, thanks so much.
Before you do, show your channel.
Please come visit my little channel. It's a mixture of politics, a bit of art, a bit of popular culture. I've had a bit of a break over Christmas. I've not been on Twitter. I've not really been on anything. But I'm going to have to get back into things next week, go back to Melbourne, do some work. So, yeah. You mentioned books on Australia. I'd say The Fatal Shore by Robert Hughes. If you haven't read that book, what on earth are you doing? Why have you not read it? Also, anything by Keith Windschuttle, who's a fantastic author, and particularly on the truth about Aboriginal history. I'd recommend anything by Keith Windschuttle. And there's an Australian author called Peter Fitzsimons, who writes great history books. Well, there's so many, but start with Hughes if you haven't, because that's the best book you will ever read on the bloody birth of Australia, particularly on Australia Day.
The Fatal Shore by Hughes is, if you're an Australian, you have to read that book.
Completely. It's the book. Yeah, fantastic. And that's if you got to start anywhere, you start there. That's the one. But I'm going to go, and thank you so much for having me on, and it's been great, and it's always lovely to see Furious, and hopefully we will get to meet up in person in a couple of weeks, hopefully.
Indeed, fingers crossed.
Yeah, I hope all goes well with that.
We're not supposed to talk about this too much.
No.
Lady Schlott, thank you very, very much.
Oh, no, thank you. And thanks so much to everybody in the chat.
I will put a link to your channel in the description after the
Thanks so much. That's wonderful. And a fantastic Australia Day to everyone. We're very, very lucky to be on this amazing island. And thanks to everyone in the chat, because without them, it doesn't really, we're just talking to ourselves if other people don't show up. So thanks so much.
True. Very true, lady. Very true.
Yeah. God bless everyone. Take care.
Happy Australia Day.
Yeah, you all look after yourself. Go well. Take care.
All right. Well, I'll run that past Apostolic Majesty, because the thing is too is that
I think that would be a good way, because Italy in the mid-30s was not particularly anti-British. It really wasn't.
No. Well, this is the thing. And I mean, I'm not having a dig at you, Australian. I just saw the comment about WOG history. But this is the thing too, is that interestingly enough, various aspects of history is kind of intersected with one another. Like the reason why Australian divisions fight in Africa essentially is because, in part, of this dispute over the Suez Canal and Abyssinia.
Yep.
You know, and the reason why Australian and Italian men end up shooting at each other in North Africa for the best part of 2.5 years is in part a result of this crisis. And it is unfortunate because there were much in the same way that, I mean, and it's interesting that someone like Neville Chamberlain, right, who is reviled amongst neocons as being, you know, it's actually funny that my opinion of Neville Chamberlain's changed substantially in the last maybe 3 or 4 years. He's reviled as an appeaser and a weakling and this, that, and the other. But still, you know, he was at least insightful enough to engage in rearmament as an industrial program for Britain. But what Neville Chamberlain did seek to do was to keep his country out of war, which was a noble objective.
Very sensible thing to do. But then he gave a great big massive red war bond to Poland, which is insanity to me. But that's just me.
Precisely.
You know?
But that wasn't even his doing. That was the doing of the British government by and large. That wasn't necessarily Chamberlain's position.
In the 1890s, Britain was very happy to do military demonstrations in Sudan or wherever to help the Italians, right, in Abyssinia. Whereas by the late 1930s, when Mussolini said, fuck Adwa, because it was Adwa that he was trying to, which was a massive Italian defeat. But Mussolini said, fuck Adwa, we're going to take back Abyssinia. Instead of Britain just saying, well, we don't care, which is what I would have done, because I would have
made a
said,
song and dance about it.
Yeah, I would have said, you know, Kenyan colonists will get on great with Italian Abyssinian colonists, as they did in reality. There was, you know, all this nonsense with the what was the proto-United Nations called? The League of Nations. Whereas no one would do anything except the Brits. And the Brits didn't really want to do anything, but they had to pretend to, which kind of made England and, Britain and Italy enemies when they really didn't need to be. Because why did Britain care who ran Abyssinia? I'm sure it would have been better run by the Italians than the Abyssinians.
Well, this is the thing. And I mean, my grandfather's now long passed away. I was still in high school when he departed, but as a North Africa veteran, I mean, he used to always talk about Abyssinia. And what's actually interesting is the woman he married, my grandmother, her father actually, funnily enough, ran. He actually resided in Addis Ababa. He actually had shops. You know, he was actually like something of an entrepreneur, which he lost all of it during the war, obviously. But actually, if it wasn't for the outbreak of the war, chances are my grandmother and like their whole family would have ended up being colonists in Abyssinia. So, you know, I'm a filthy colonist in that context as well. But needless to say, the thing is that my grandfather distinctly remembered newspapers being printed of the Italian press saying, the British who own Africa from Cape to Cairo are, essentially taking umbrage with the fact that we have this score to settle with Ethiopia. And that was actually the Italian sentiment. And the other thing too was that the fact that the British closed the Suez Canal. So the Italian Navy, one of the reasons the Italians had some difficulties in the Abyssinia campaign was because the British shut the Suez and the Italians had to reinforce and essentially supply their Eritrean and Somalian army corps around Africa, which, as you can imagine, makes it a whole lot more difficult and has a lot more duration to the supply lines.
All I would say is this is kind of a political stream.
Kind of, yeah.
Yeah, and we're talking about kind of a historical stream.
No, of course, yes.
Yeah, and me, I love all historical subjects in the same way that you do. And I just think, sorry,
I was just answering the question in detail.
To give one example, South African troops were used to defeat the Italians in Abyssinia. So what the Brits were there doing were they were using the people running South Africa and Rhodesians, by the way, to go and beat the same sort of people from Italy in Abyssinia, which was entirely stupid from both their points of view. But apparently no one noticed that at the time. But anyway,
yeah. The tragedy is that European men squabbled over crap.
Britain would help Italy do stuff in that part of the world because that's what European nations did.
Yeah, and also too is that one of the reasons that Italy changed its allegiance from the Triple Alliance with Austria and Germany in World War I to Britain is that Italian and British industry actually had relatively close contacts. A large number of firms that were of British, like from Britain, helped Italian naval industry, such as the firm that comes to mind is Ansaldo and Fossati, who basically ran shipyards in Italy in the turn of the century, were as a courtesy of British assistance. And there's actually, what's interesting too is a number of modern day Italian football clubs, as in, like soccer clubs, Genoa FC and AC Milan come to mind, were actually, and I think the Cagliari, which is the club in Sardinia, were basically founded by British sailors, or were in part founded as a result of British sailors whose naval detachments were in Italian docks. And because football came from Britain, they started playing them there, and they actually founded these clubs, and they were essentially founded as British football clubs or sporting clubs that were tied to the Royal Navy. And then obviously as Britain and Italy diverged in their different courses, they sort of evolved into the modern day Italian football clubs, but they actually have a British heritage.
Doesn't surprise me. It doesn't surprise me at all. Look,
but yeah.
But like I said, that's a historical subject. I'd like to do that with you.
We'll get there. We'll get there.
Yeah, if you and your mate there, who's one of my favorite historians, are interested, I'd happily do that one. But anyway,
yeah, we'd love to.
Anything you would like to promote, sir?
Well, I've already mentioned a couple streams that I'll be on. One I have been on, one I will be on. But what I will say is that if there's two books I recommend, there's the one I mentioned earlier, which is a nice little insight into World War II Australia, which is and the POWs, which is Spaghetti, Rabbits and Spaghetti. It's a very, very good book. And the other book I would recommend, and it's sort of in that sort of same ilk as what's that author's name that Lady Schlott mentioned? Shuttlecock or Whittlecock, whatever his name was, who writes about the Aborigines. There's another book, and it's so hard to find, but if you can find Cape York, the Savage Frontier by Rodney Liddell, that there is of the same note, and it's very, very hard to find. It's very expensive when it comes off for sale, to the point where the ABC basically went ballistic against it and went on a campaign of career destruction against Liddell in the early 90s and mid 90s over it. So that's an interesting insight as well. But the other thing is, just as a bit of a sort of another white pill, if I may say, because I know sort of obviously when I come onto a stream, there's obviously this inherent med aspect that I always get asked questions and my answers are couched in a certain perspective. Is that there is oh no, I'm fine. I just want to say that.
Yeah, I don't get this. Like, you know what, mate? No Roman Empire, no British Empire, no Australia, frankly. But
the thing is that I just want to say that there's much about like Australian literature and Australian folklore that actually is worthwhile reading about. And those of us who've lived here, who've grown up here, who are at least familiar with Australia, or for those who are just interested in Australia, there is, actually, funnily enough, I had a friend of mine. She was sort of looking for movie material, and I suggested to her Kings and Grass Castles, and I love Kings and Grass Castles, and it was one of my favorite movies growing up in terms of like an adult movie, right? But Kings and Grass Castles is about an Irish family that are enduring the potato famine, and the main character, Patrick, his uncle dies. And he inherits literally like a handful of pounds and shillings. Like it's a very modest inheritance because they barely have enough money to get by from month to month. And he ends up selling the family pig to buy like tickets to come to Australia. and it's a fantastic. That they actually turned into a movie in the mid '90s, I think. And they turned into a movie, and it's actually very much worth watching. It's a very, very well made. It's on a modest budget, but it's a very nice movie. It's an interesting story, and I mean, this family, I believe they arrive in Queensland, and they end up building quite a large, lucrative network of properties. They work very hard, they get by, and then the family actually loses a lot of money. I think there's like I think it's the Austrian stock market crash of like 1895 or something. And all of their properties in Brisbane become liquidated. But what Patrick does when he actually was wealthy, that he gifted his sons each a station in the Kimberleys in Western Australia. And so the whole family then migrate across the country from Queensland to WA. And eventually he sort of sees out his final years. He lives and eventually dies in the Kimberleys. And that's the story of the Durack family. And the Duracks today are still sort of a family of noteworthiness in WA and in sort of Perth by and large. They sort of keep a low profile, but their descendants are still sort of here. And Kings and Grass Castles is a fabulous movie, and it's also a fantastic book. And I think it's fitting that on Australia Day, rather than me having some kind of Roman recommendation, I'll offer an Australian one, and that is watch the movie and read the book. Kings and Grass Castles is fantastic.
Sounds good.
Should we?
I would also recommend the book, A Town Like Alice. The movie misses out at least half of the book, but the book is actually quite good.
Just going to say, Andrew, did you see if we want to close out the stream, did you see that YouTube link I put in the private chat? Because I think that would be a wonderful way to end this stream.
I'll find it. The way I'm going to end this stream is the music, but I will find that
Actually,
one.
maybe before we get it, but we can watch it together with our viewers.
All right, we'll do this one first. If I can get it to play.
Because this actually almost brings a tear to my eye. It's very it reminds me, and it will remind us of the country that no longer exists. But these are the kind of men that this country used to produce.
Yep.
So let's watch it.
All right. If it plays, I will definitely do it. Oh, come on. This is something I've played so often. I have played this so often because I so love it. Wow. Furious. I have played this at least 5 times. Because I get you.
Bring it up.
I really do like it. Yeah, I'll get it up anyway. If I can, I will get it to play. Wow. All right. Well, there you go.
Here we go.
And he sang and he sang, down like Indy, waltzing Matilda, waltzing Matilda with me. And he sang and he sang that, down like Indy, stuck a bag, no, now waltzing Matilda with me.
It's such a lovely clip.
white Australian Anglo-Celtic men march away into history.
And also, real men sing and real men whistle with their compatriots and brothers in arms.
Yeah, they do, man. They do, 100%. Thank you very much to my guests this evening, Furious Pernax and Lady Charlotte, of course, and also Tim Worms. Please go and check out their channels. In an hour or two, if you look in the description of this stream, you will find links to their channels. I'm going to finish this up on a tune, which strange to say, Furious and I almost came up with the same tune. So there we go.
Also, cheers, Iron Duke, and cheers to everyone in the chat. Much appreciated. I know a bit blackpiddling the stream, but hopefully we threw a few white pills, and hope you all had a wonderful day and with friends and family. Crack open a tinny and shrimp on the barbie, etc. Have some lamb chops. Actually, funnily enough, I've lamb chops for dinner, so I'm doing my best to still assimilate into Australian culture. Funnily enough, it's my own lambs though. So
I'm drinking Victoria. I'm drinking Victoria Bear. So there we
based. Anyways, take care, all. God bless.
I don't normally, but just for Australia. Anyway, I'm going to play this. We'll see how we go.
Oh, there once was a swagman camped by a billabong bar tree, and he sang as he looked at his old Billy boiling. Who'll come waltzing Matilda with me? Who'll come waltzing leading a water bag? Who'll come waltzing Matilda with me? Down came a jumbuck to drink at the water hole. Up jumped the swagman and grabbed him with glee, and he sang as he shoved him away in his tucker bag. You'll come waltzing Matilda with me. Who'll come waltzing Matilda, my darling? Who'll come waltzing Matilda with me? Waltzing Matilda and leading a water bag. Who'll come waltzing Matilda with me? Down came the squatter a-riding on his thoroughbred. Down came policeman, 1, 2, 3. Whose is the jumbuck you've got in your tucker bag? You'll come waltzing Matilda with me. Who'll come waltzing Matilda and leading the water bag? Who'll come waltzing Matilda with me? But the swagman he up and he jumped into the water hole, drowning himself by the cooliebar tree. And his ghost may be heard as it sings in the billabong. Who'll come waltzing Matilda with me? Who'll come waltzing Matilda, my darling? Who'll come waltzing Matilda with me? Waltzing Matilda and leading the water bag. Who'll come waltzing Matilda with me? Who'll come waltzing Matilda, my darling? Who'll come waltzing Matilda with me? Waltzing Matilda and leading the water bag. Who'll come waltzing Matilda?
Beautiful, Iron Duke. Thank you. And happy Australia Day, everyone.
Yeah, absolutely. Happy Australia Day. Thanks for joining us. And check us out next time, guys.